At my sister's engagement party, my mother tapped her crystal glass and announced to a room full of millionaires, "Oh, this is my other daughter, Zuri. She cleans floors for a living." My father chuckled loudly, adding that every family has one. But the groom's father, a ruthless real estate mogul, did not laugh. His smile completely vanished. His eyes locked onto the thick, jagged scar running across my left palm. He stood up slowly, silencing the entire ballroom, and asked, "Could I speak with you outside?" Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. I am Zuri, and at 35 years old, I am intimately familiar with the unique brand of cruelty that only blood relatives can inflict. We were gathered at one of the most exclusive country clubs in Atlanta, Georgia, to celebrate the engagement of my younger sister, Chloe. The room was a testament to excessive wealth and relentless social climbing. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over tables draped in imported silk linens. Thousands of white orchids spilled from massive centerpieces, and a live string quartet played softly in the background. My family had spared no expense to impress the Thorne family. My mother, Valerie, was in her element. She moved through the crowd of Atlanta elite like a queen holding court. Her tailored designer gown and perfectly styled hair projected the exact image she cared about more than anything else in the world: flawless success. My father, Calvin, trailed slightly behind her, offering firm handshakes and booming laughs, playing the role of the prosperous patriarch. And then there was Chloe, the undisputed golden child of our family. Chloe was 28, effortlessly beautiful, and wearing an engagement ring that probably cost more than the average house. She was marrying Julian Thorne, a wealthy white architect, whose family name carried generations of old money and real estate power in the city. I stood in the shadowy corner of the ballroom nursing a glass of sparkling water. I wore a simple black dress blending into the background exactly as my parents preferred. For as long as I can remember, my role in the family was to be the invisible backdrop against which Chloe could shine. When Chloe brought home a B-, my parents praised her effort. When I brought home straight A report cards, they simply asked why I had not joined more extracurricular clubs to round out my resume. The message was always clear. Chloe was the star and I was the disappointment who just did not know how to play the corporate game. The evening was going perfectly according to my mother's grand plan until it was time for the toasts. The string quartet stopped playing, and a hush fell over the opulent room. My mother stepped to the center of the dance floor, holding a crystal champagne flute. She smiled radiantly at Chloe and Julian, painting a picture of a perfect, loving family. She spoke about Chloe's supposed brilliance, her charm, and how the Thorne family was gaining a true treasure. The affluent crowd murmured in polite agreement, raising their glasses. But my mother has never been able to let a moment of triumph pass without using it as a weapon against me. She turned her gaze toward my dark corner of the room. The spotlight shifted, and suddenly hundreds of eyes were searching the shadows to find me. "And of course, we have Zuri," my mother announced, her voice projecting clearly across the silent ballroom. Her tone dripped with a toxic mixture of fake pity and deep satisfaction. She gave a small, dismissive wave in my direction. "This is my other daughter. She means well, but she cleans floors for a living." A heavy, awkward silence dropped over the crowd. The wealthy socialites and real estate tycoons exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure of how to react to such a blatant public humiliation. My father, Calvin, immediately stepped in to break the tension, but not to defend me. He let out a loud, booming chuckle that echoed off the marble walls. "Do not worry, folks," he laughed, clapping a hand on a nearby guest's shoulder. "Every family has got one." The room erupted into polite, nervous laughter. They were laughing at me. My own parents had just reduced my entire existence to a humiliating punchline in front of 300 high society strangers. They wanted to make sure the Thorne family knew that I was not a reflection of their status, that I was just the unfortunate embarrassment they graciously tolerated out of familial duty. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not run out of the room. Years of emotional survival had taught me how to detach from their cruelty. I simply stood there, my face perfectly stoic, while my heart hammered a painful rhythm against my ribs. I looked over at Chloe, expecting perhaps a tiny shred of sisterly defense. Instead, Chloe leaned into Julian, her stunning features twisted into a condescending smirk. "Zuri means well," she whispered loudly enough for Julian's parents and the surrounding tables to hear. "But she just is not built for the corporate world like we are. Mom and Dad still have to slip her grocery money just to keep her afloat. We try to help her out, but you know how it is." The lie was so blatant, so flawlessly delivered that it physically took my breath away. She was referencing a time 10 years ago when I was 25 years old, working night shifts and struggling to survive. I had asked my parents for a $50 loan just to buy food for the week. They had laughed at me, told me I needed to learn the harsh realities of independence, and refused to give me a single dime. I had eaten plain rice for 6 days straight, while they bought Chloe a brand new luxury car for getting a minor promotion at a job they helped her secure. Now, a decade later, Chloe was weaponizing my lowest moment of poverty to elevate her own status in front of her wealthy future in-laws. She was painting me as a pathetic, dependent charity case to make her own superficial achievements look like monumental triumphs of hard work. I felt a familiar burning sensation in the back of my throat, but I forced myself to remain entirely still. I slowly lowered my gaze and wrapped my right hand securely over my left palm. It was a nervous habit, a protective gesture I had developed years ago to hide the thick, jagged scar that slashed violently across my left hand. The scarred tissue was raised and lighter than the rest of my dark skin, a permanent physical reminder of the night my entire life changed. I kept it hidden from my family because they would only use it as another excuse to call me reckless and careless. As I covered my scarred hand, I glanced toward the head table where Julian's family sat. Julian looked mildly uncomfortable, but he said nothing, choosing to sip his champagne rather than correct his future bride. But Julian's father, Winston Thorne, was a different story entirely. Winston was a notoriously ruthless real estate mogul, a man who had built a massive empire and commanded absolute respect in every room he entered. He had been politely smiling through my mother's toast, playing the part of the gracious host. But when my father chuckled and Chloe delivered her vicious whisper about my supposed failures, Winston's smile completely vanished. The older man was not looking at my mother. He was not looking at his son or at Chloe. His sharp, piercing eyes were locked directly onto me. More specifically, his gaze was fixed intensely on my hands. In the brief moment before I had covered my left palm, the bright light from a nearby chandelier had caught the jagged edges of my scar, illuminating it clearly across the short distance between us. I saw Winston's posture go completely rigid. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking almost ghost, like under the crystal lights. His breathing hitched visibly, and his hands gripping the edge of the linen-draped table began to tremble. The transition was so sudden, so jarring, that the people sitting nearest to him stopped laughing and turned to stare. My mother, noticing the sudden shift in the patriarch's demeanor, immediately stopped smiling. Panic flashed across her perfectly made-up face. She assumed Winston was offended by my presence, that my lowly status as a floor cleaner was ruining the elite atmosphere of his son's engagement party. She shot me a venomous glare, silently commanding me to disappear into the woodwork before I caused any more damage to her carefully constructed social climbing dreams. But Winston did not look away from me. He slowly pushed his chair back and stood up. The movement was deliberate and heavy, commanding the attention of the entire ballroom. The remaining murmurs of conversation died away instantly. The clinking of silverware stopped. 300 guests held their breath, waiting to see what the billionaire patriarch would do. Winston ignored them all. He ignored my mother's nervous attempts to offer more champagne. He ignored Chloe's confused, questioning gaze. He walked around the massive head table, his eyes never leaving my face. The sheer intensity of his stare made my pulse race, but I stood my ground, holding my hands tightly together. He stopped a few feet away from me. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. My parents exchanged terrified looks, fully expecting Winston to demand that I be thrown out of the country club by security. I braced myself for the final, ultimate humiliation of being escorted off the premises. Instead, Winston took a slow, shaky breath. His voice when he spoke was completely devoid of his usual commanding corporate authority. It was quiet, trembling with an emotion I could not quite identify. "Could I speak with you outside?" he asked. He did not wait for my answer. He turned and walked directly toward the heavy glass doors leading out to the private terrace, disappearing into the cool night air. The entire ballroom remained frozen in stunned silence. And as I slowly unfolded my hands, feeling the rough edge of my scar, I realized that the life my family thought they knew was about to be completely destroyed. Winston stands there, towering over the head table. The crystal chandeliers seem to dim under the sudden heavy weight of his gaze. The soft, elegant hum of the string quartet completely dies out, leaving a suffocating silence in the grand ballroom of the country club. When he asks to speak with me outside, his voice is a low, unreadable rumble that sends an immediate shockwave through my family. Calvin freezes in place, his booming, artificial laugh caught in his throat like a swallowed bone. Chloe's condescending smirk vanishes instantly, replaced by a panicked, open-mouthed stare. She frantically looks up at Julian, seeking reassurance, but Julian is just as bewildered, staring at his father in total confusion. Before I can even formulate a response to Winston, the sharp, manicured nails of my mother dig violently into my bare forearm. Valerie's grip is like a vise of polished acrylic. She jerks me backward, pulling me further into the shadows, and stepping into my personal space so quickly I can smell the expensive floral perfume layered over her sudden, nervous sweat. Her face has completely drained of its rich, warm color, leaving her usually flawless makeup looking like an ashen, rigid mask. She leans in incredibly close, her voice a venomous, panicked hiss meant only for my ears. "You have embarrassed us for the absolute last time, Zuri." Her nails dig deeper, threatening to break the skin. "You will walk outside right now. You will apologize to Mr. Thorne immediately for whatever you did to offend him, and then you will leave through the back kitchen doors before you ruin your sister's future completely. Do you understand me?" She shakes my arm for emphasis, her eyes wild with the sheer desperation of a social climber watching her entire house of cards teeter on the edge of a catastrophic collapse. She is entirely convinced that Winston is disgusted by my presence. She truly thinks the billionaire patriarch is so deeply offended by the existence of a floor cleaner at his son's lavish engagement party that he intends to personally throw me off the pristine premises. The absolute terror in her eyes reveals everything about how she views me in this world. I am not a daughter to her. I am a liability. I am a stubborn, dark stain on the immaculate tapestry of affluent black excellence she has spent decades desperately weaving. That suffocating grip on my arm, the stinging, sharp pain of her nails pressing into my flesh, the desperate, angry whisper demanding I disappear into the background. It is a highly specific physical sensation I know all too well. It instantly rips me backward in time, plunging me violently into the humid, stifling heat of a June afternoon nearly 17 years ago. It was the day of my high school graduation. I had just proudly walked across the stage, clutching my hard-earned diploma with fierce pride, having barely survived 4 years of rigorous advanced placement classes while working grueling night shifts at a local diner just to pay for my own basic school supplies. I walked out onto the expansive green school lawn, eagerly scanning the massive crowd for my family. When I finally located them, they were already posing for a hired professional photographer under a large, sprawling oak tree. Calvin, Valerie, and Chloe were dressed in perfectly color-coordinated lavender and cream outfits. They looked like a glossy magazine advertisement for a flawless, wealthy family. I ran up to happily join them wearing a simple, faded yellow sundress I had bought from a neighborhood thrift store for $6. I could not afford anything better, and they had flatly refused to buy me a graduation dress, claiming Chloe desperately needed the money for her upcoming elite cheerleading camp. The very moment I eagerly stepped into the camera's frame, Valerie's hand shot out. She grabbed my arm with the exact same vicious acrylic nailed grip she is using right now. She yanked me completely out of the frame, her camera-ready smile never leaving her face as she looked directly at the photographer. She quickly pulled me behind a large decorative shrub, and hissed the cruel words that would define the fundamental nature of our relationship forever. Your cheap dress is an absolute embarrassment, Zuri. You clash with everything we are trying to do here. Go sit in the hot car until we are completely finished. I spent the next hour sitting in the sweltering, suffocating heat of Calvin's locked sedan, watching through the tinted windows as my family smiled, laughed, and celebrated my massive academic milestone without me. They beautifully framed those lavender and cream photos and proudly hung them all over the living room walls. A perfect, harmonious family of three. I was entirely erased from my own achievement. The phantom sting of that graduation day memory slowly fades, bringing me sharply back to the opulent ballroom of the modern country club. Valerie is still tightly holding my arm, still anxiously waiting for my obedient, silent submission. She fully expects me to lower my head, absorb her vicious insult, and silently vanish through the service corridors like the lowly hired help she believes me to be. I look down at her manicured hand gripping my skin. Then I look directly into her panicked, furious brown eyes. I do not argue with her. I do not raise my voice or cause the loud, chaotic scene she is so deeply terrified of. I simply twist my arm with a sharp, calculated motion, breaking her iron grip completely. She stumbles back a half step, genuinely shocked by the quiet, undeniable defiance. I calmly smooth the fabric of my simple black dress, turn my back on my mother, and begin walking toward Winston. The long journey across the massive ballroom feels like walking for miles. The 300 elite guests silently part like the Red Sea, their eyes burning into me with a heavy mixture of misplaced pity and morbid high society curiosity. I can hear the distinct rustle of expensive silk and the muted, anxious clinking of crystal glasses as I pass the lavishly decorated tables. Every single step I take away from my family and toward the imposing figure of the real estate mogul feels incredibly heavy with anticipation. I am fully bracing myself for the verbal lashing of a lifetime. I am mentally preparing the professional, detached, polite apology I will calmly deliver when Winston Thorne looks down his nose and tells me I am unfit to breathe the same refined air as his successful family. I prepare to be swiftly thrown out of the country club, mapping out the most direct route to the valet stand in my head, so I can exit the grounds with at least a tiny fraction of my dignity intact. Winston turns his broad back and firmly pushes open the heavy, brass-handled glass doors leading to the expansive outdoor terrace. He steps out into the dark night, holding the heavy door open for me to follow. I step over the polished threshold, moving away from the stifling perfume-heavy air of the crowded ballroom, and stepping directly into the crisp, biting chill of the Atlanta evening. The heavy glass doors swing shut behind me with a solid, echoing thud. The immediate vacuum seal of the thick glass instantly cuts off the anxious murmurs, the heavy tension, and the suffocating presence of my toxic family. Out here on the expansive stone terrace, it is just me, the sweeping, glittering view of the downtown city skyline, and the billionaire patriarch who has the absolute power to ruin my sister's precious wedding with a single spoken word. I stand tall, keeping my scarred left hand resting casually against the dark fabric of my dress. I ready my mind for the impending hostility. I wait for the arrogant elitist dismissal, the stern demand that I stay far away from his successful son and his perfect new daughter-in-law. I brace my entire body for the storm. But the storm never comes. Winston Thorne does not yell at me. He does not point a condemning finger toward the distant valet parking lot. He slowly turns to face me, and the imposing, ruthless corporate giant I fully expected to see is entirely gone. His broad, tailored shoulders sag heavily, as if an invisible, crushing weight has suddenly been lifted from them. The harsh, calculated lines of his face remarkably soften into a look of absolute, breathtaking vulnerability. He takes a slow, hesitant step toward me, and the ambient light from the towering city skyline reveals what my mother and sister could never have possibly anticipated. Winston's hands, the very hands that control billions of dollars in commercial real estate, The hands that just effortlessly silenced a ballroom full of high society elites are trembling uncontrollably. He looks down at my left hand, then slowly raises his gaze up to meet my eyes, and takes a slow, jagged breath that sounds almost exactly like a sob. The sheer intensity of the emotion radiating from him is completely paralyzing, making the cold night air feel suddenly charged with an unspoken, profound truth I never saw coming. The crisp night air hits me the moment the heavy glass door seals shut behind us. Winston Thorne does not turn to face the glittering skyline of Atlanta. He remains completely focused on me. The ambient light from the towering skyscrapers casts long shadows across the smooth stone terrace, but it provides more than enough illumination to show the raw tension radiating from his rigid posture. I keep my back perfectly straight and my chin elevated. I am fully prepared for him to hand me a check and tell me to stay far away from his son's perfect new family. I am ready for the disgust. I am ready for the elite condescension. Instead, he takes another slow step forward until he is standing less than 3 feet away. Please, he says, his voice cracking in a way that completely strips away his billionaire persona. Show me your hand. I instinctively pull my left arm back, a defensive wall dropping instantly into place. My family has never asked to see the scar. To them, it is just another ugly flaw, a physical manifestation of my supposed clumsiness. They never wanted the story behind it, so I learned to keep it buried deeply in the past. Why do you want to see it? I ask, keeping my tone steady and completely guarded. I will not let this man humiliate me any further than my mother already has. Winston exhales a ragged breath. Because I need to know if it matches the memory that has been haunting me for 10 entire years. The words hang in the freezing air between us. The sheer desperation in his eyes chips away at my defensive armor. I slowly unfold my hands and lift my left palm upward into the ambient light of the terrace. The thick, jagged ridges of the scar tissue snake violently across my dark skin, a chaotic web of healed trauma. Winston stares at it. He does not look away in disgust. He does not flinch. A single tear tracks down the weathered lines of his face. Where exactly did you get that scar? He asks, his voice barely a whisper. I look at this powerful man and decide to give him the raw, unvarnished truth. The exact truth my parents and sister never once cared to ask about because they were too busy criticizing the bloody bandages I wore for weeks. I was 25 years old. I begin, my voice calm and detached, floating over the distant hum of the city traffic. I was working the overnight sanitation shift at a commercial complex just off Interstate 285. I was completely broke, living paycheck to paycheck, and I did not own a car. I walked 2 miles to the bus stop every single night, regardless of the weather. It was a freezing Tuesday in November. I was exhausted walking along the dark shoulder of the access road when I heard the sickening screech of tires. It was followed instantly by a massive impact that physically shook the concrete beneath my cheap boots. An SUV had lost control, clipped the heavy concrete barrier, and flipped multiple times before landing completely on its roof in a steep ditch just off the highway. I ran toward it without thinking. By the time I slid down the muddy embankment, the engine compartment was already engulfed in violent flames. The heat was blinding, pushing me backward. The smell of burning rubber and melting plastic was thick and suffocating. I dropped to my knees in the wet grass and looked through the shattered driver's side window. The door was completely crushed inward, the metal buckled and fused together. The driver was trapped, suspended upside down by his seatbelt, and he was completely unconscious. Blood was pouring from a massive laceration on his forehead, pooling heavily on the interior roof of the crushed vehicle. I screamed for help, but the highway above was empty, and the fire was spreading rapidly toward the undercarriage. I knew with absolute certainty that if I waited for paramedics or the fire department, the driver would burn alive. The flames were already licking at the dashboard. The intense heat was blistering my face. I could not pry the crushed door open. The metal was locked into place. The only way in was through the partially shattered windshield. I found a heavy piece of debris from the guardrail, but it was not enough to clear the jagged, thick safety glass blocking the way. I did not have time to find a better tool. The fire was roaring now, an angry beast consuming the front half of the vehicle. So I wrapped my cheap uniform jacket around my hand and punched straight through the remaining thick glass of the windshield. The glass shredded right through the thin fabric and sliced deeply into my palm, severing muscle and skin. I felt the hot blood immediately running down my wrist, but the adrenaline completely masked the pain. I reached inside the burning cabin, unbuckled the trapped driver, and grabbed him by the heavy shoulders of his suit jacket. I dragged his dead weight through the broken windshield, pulling him violently up the muddy embankment just seconds before the SUV's gas tank ignited in a massive fireball that threw us both backward into the dirt. I lay there in the freezing mud, gasping for air, my left hand completely mangled and bleeding profusely. The driver was still unconscious, his breathing shallow and erratic. His head wound was severe and pumping blood rapidly. I took off my jacket, the one that was already ruined by the glass and the dirt, and wrapped it tightly around his bleeding head to apply direct pressure and slow the blood loss. I pressed my hands against his skull, fighting to keep him alive in the darkness. In the distance, I finally heard the faint wail of approaching sirens. Red and blue lights began to flash against the dark tree line cutting through the smoke. That was when the absolute terror of my own reality set in. I was 25 years old and I had absolutely no health insurance. I was barely making rent. If the paramedics found me sitting there bleeding, they would force me into an ambulance. They would take me to the emergency room for the severe lacerations on my hand. A single hospital visit, a single night in an emergency ward would bankrupt me completely. It would mean immediate eviction. It would mean losing the tiny roach-infested apartment I had fought so hard to secure. I could not afford to be a hero on paper. I could not afford the crippling medical debt that destroys lives. So as the first ambulance pulled up to the burning wreckage and the paramedics jumped out, I slipped away into the dark woods. I walked 3 miles in the freezing cold, with my hand wrapped in my own bloody shirt, terrified and completely alone. I cleaned the deep wound myself with drugstore supplies and wrapped it in cheap gauze. I kept it hidden from my family so they would not mock me for my clumsiness. They never asked why I wore a thick bandage for a month, and I never told them. I finished speaking. The silence on the terrace is absolute and deafening. The distant sounds of Atlanta traffic continue to hum in the background, a stark contrast to the absolute stillness of the man standing in front of me. I wait for Winston Thorne to speak. I wait for him to process this gritty, violent story that stands in such sharp contrast to the polished elite engagement party happening just on the other side of the glass doors. I expect him to offer a polite nod, perhaps a clinical acknowledgement of a highly traumatic event from my past. Instead, Winston exhales a sharp, shaky breath. He does not say a single word. He reaches up with his right hand and grips the cuff of his expensive tailored suit jacket. Slowly, deliberately, he unbuttons the cuff and rolls the fine dark fabric up his left arm. He then unbuttons his crisp white dress shirt, pulling the expensive material past his wrist, past his forearm, all the way to his elbow. He steps closer to the terrace light and turns his bare arm outward toward me. The entire length of his forearm is covered in thick, knotted burn scars. The skin is raised, shiny, and heavily discolored, telling a silent, horrific story of surviving intense, localized heat. It is the undeniable, permanent physical mark of a man who was trapped inside a burning vehicle while the flames melted the dashboard right next to his arm. My breath catches sharply in my throat. I stare at the severe burn scars and then slowly look up into Winston's eyes. They are shining brightly with unshed tears. He was the driver. The billionaire patriarch of the Thorne family, the ruthless real estate mogul sitting at the absolute pinnacle of Atlanta society, was the unconscious, bleeding man I had dragged through the freezing mud 10 years ago. "I have spent an entire decade looking for you, Winston," whispers his voice thick with an overwhelming, crushing gratitude. "I hired elite private investigators. I scoured local hospital records. I ran anonymous advertisements in every paper. I looked absolutely everywhere for the anonymous black woman who shattered a burning windshield with her bare hand, wrapped her jacket around my bleeding head, and completely vanished into the freezing night." The paramedics told me the jacket wrapped around my head smelled strongly of commercial cleaning supplies. They told me the person who saved me had to have been bleeding heavily based on the blood left on the grass, but no local clinics reported treating a severe hand laceration that night. You saved my life, Zuri. You sacrificed your own hand, you risked your own life, and you asked for absolutely nothing in return. I stand completely frozen for a fraction of a second, absorbing the raw gravity of his words. The cold wind sweeping across the terrace suddenly feels entirely insignificant compared to the intense emotional heat radiating from the billionaire standing before me. Winston Thorne, a man known throughout Atlanta for his absolute ruthlessness in business, is looking at me with a level of profound reverence that I have never once experienced from my own flesh and blood. I look down at my scarred hand and then back up to the severe burn marks covering his forearm. The invisible tether connecting us across a decade of silence pulls tight. For 10 years, I carried the weight of that night alone, bearing the trauma under long work hours and heavy bandages, while my family mocked my clumsiness. To finally be seen, to finally be acknowledged by the very person whose life I pulled from the flames, leaves me temporarily breathless. I do not offer empty platitudes or pretend it was nothing. We both know exactly what happened on that highway. We both know the brutal reality of survival. Winston slowly lowers his sleeve, carefully buttoning the crisp white fabric over his ruined flesh, as if sealing away the vulnerable survivor and summoning back the formidable titan of industry. The transition is remarkable to witness. His shoulders square, his posture straightens, and the sharp, calculating intellect that built the Thorne real estate empire returns to his piercing blue eyes. But this time, his formidable presence is not directed at me as a threat. It is a protective shield. He turns his head slightly, looking through the heavy glass doors at the lavish engagement party continuing without us. We can see my mother, Valerie, frantically fluttering around the elite guests wearing a mask of fake joy while anxiously darting her eyes toward the terrace. We can see Chloe clinging to Julian, laughing too loudly at jokes that are not funny. Winston turns his attention back to me, his jaw clenching with sudden intense anger. Your mother said you clean floors for a living. He states, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble that vibrates in the quiet night air. He shakes his head with absolute disgust. I know for a fact that the woman who shattered my burning windshield and dragged my unconscious body up a muddy embankment is not someone who settles for the bottom rung of the ladder. You have the heart of a survivor, Zuri. You have the grit of a fighter. So I am going to ask you a very direct question, and I expect the absolute truth. What do you actually do for a living? I look at this man who owes me his life, and I make a split-second decision to trust him with the one secret I have guarded more fiercely than my own physical scars. I take a deep, steadying breath, letting the crisp night air fill my lungs, and decide to drop the carefully constructed facade of the struggling dependent daughter. I did not stay a floor cleaner, I tell him, keeping my gaze locked directly on his. That night, 10 years ago, when I walked away from your burning car, with my hand shredded to pieces, I realized something fundamental about my existence. I realized that nobody was coming to save me. My family had made it abundantly clear that they would gladly let me drown if it meant they could stay on dry land. I had to pay my rent, and I could barely hold a mop with my heavily bandaged hand. So I stopped cleaning the floors myself, and I started hiring other people to do it. I took every single ounce of grit I had left in my exhausted body, and I built a company. Winston watches me intently, his sharp eyes not missing a single shifting nuance in my posture. I stand taller, rolling my shoulders back, and finally occupying the physical space I have denied myself all evening. I started with a single broken-down van and 3 employees willing to work the graveyard shifts. I explain, my voice gaining a steady, powerful cadence. We took the miserable contracts nobody else wanted. The hazardous cleanups, the industrial waste, the massive abandoned commercial warehouses. I reinvested every single dollar back into the business for 5 straight years. I slept on a cot in my cramped office. I ate cold food over accounting ledgers. I taught myself commercial logistics, supply chain management, and advanced corporate sanitation protocols. I did not just build a cleaning service, Winston. I built an infrastructure powerhouse. Today, I am the sole founder and chief executive officer of Vanguard Facilities Group. We are a $50 million commercial sanitation and logistics empire operating across the entire southeastern seaboard. The sheer magnitude of the revelation hits Winston with a visible physical force. His eyes widen in absolute, genuine shock, and his mouth parts slightly as he processes the staggering financial figures. The woman his future daughter-in-law just publicly humiliated as a penniless burden is entirely self-made and incredibly powerful, but the shock on his face is quickly replaced by something else. A flicker of deep recognition dances across his sharp features. He narrows his eyes, repeating the name of my company softly under his breath. Vanguard Facilities Group. He says the words, slowly testing the familiar weight of them on his tongue. Yes, Vanguard. I confirm, allowing a small, tight smile to touch the corners of my mouth. I watch as the realization rapidly clicks into place within his brilliant strategic mind. You are a very difficult man to get a meeting with, Winston, but your property managers are not. 2 years ago, Thorne Real Estate was looking to consolidate its entire maintenance and sanitation contracts for all commercial properties in the downtown district. You wanted a single, reliable vendor who could handle your massive portfolio with absolute discretion and flawless execution. Vanguard submitted the winning bid. We hold the primary maintenance contracts for your entire corporate empire, Winston. We have been highly lucrative business partners for 24 months. Winston actually takes a full step backward, gripping the stone railing of the terrace to steady himself. He lets out a loud, barking laugh of pure disbelief, running a hand through his graying hair. He shakes his head, looking at me as if he is seeing an absolute ghost. You are Vanguard, he whispers, his voice thick with a mixture of shock and profound admiration. I have read those quarterly reports, Zuri. The efficiency metrics are staggering. Your company revolutionized the maintenance protocols for my flagship properties, saving my corporation millions of dollars in operational waste. I demanded to meet the CEO of Vanguard last year to personally renegotiate the regional expansion contracts. But the CEO never showed up. I prefer to remain entirely behind the scenes. I explain, calmly maintaining my steady composure. I send my senior corporate lawyers and my chief operations officer to handle all face-to-face meetings and high-level negotiations. I look back through the glass doors at my parents, who are currently trying to aggressively network with a local judge. My family is obsessed with status, wealth, and social climbing. If they ever found out that the floor cleaner they constantly mock had quietly become a multimillionaire, they would drain me dry. They would demand money houses and unlimited investments while simultaneously taking all the credit for my success. They would weaponize my wealth just like they weaponize my supposed poverty. So I let them believe whatever they want to believe. It keeps them out of my bank accounts and completely out of my corporate boardroom. I let them think I am the failure because my peace of mind is worth far more than their superficial validation. Winston turns his head and looks back through the heavy glass doors. We can clearly see Chloe laughing loudly, throwing her head back while clinging tightly to Julian's arm. We can see Valerie hovering near the elite guests, pouring champagne and basking in the false glory of her manufactured perfect life. They look completely ridiculous from this vantage point, like cheap actors performing in a terrible play. Winston looks at them for a long, silent minute, observing their shallow, desperate behavior with the trained eye of an apex predator. He sees the absolute toxicity, the blistering arrogance, and the staggering ignorance of the people who share my blood. They have absolutely no idea. Do they? Winston asks, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet register. They look at you and they only see a failure. They truly believe you are poor. They believe you are financially dependent on the meager crumbs they occasionally toss your way. They just publicly humiliated a woman who has a higher net worth than half the arrogant fools sitting in that ballroom. They do not know a single thing about me. I confirm my voice hard and resolute, and I intend to keep it exactly that way. Tomorrow is the wedding. After Chloe and Julian are officially married, I will simply go back to my quiet life and let them continue living in their shallow little echo chamber. Winston turns back to face me, and the look in his eyes sends a sudden sharp chill straight down my spine. The vulnerability from his earlier confession is entirely gone, completely replaced by the cold, calculating ruthlessness that built his massive real estate monopoly. He slowly straightens his tie, adjusting his expensive suit jacket with precise, measured movements. A slow, incredibly dark smile spreads across his weathered face. It is not a friendly smile. It is the smile of a man who holds all the winning cards and is eagerly preparing to destroy his opponents at the table. Zuri, Winston says softly, stepping closer so his voice is just a low hum against the cold wind. You gave me my life back 10 years ago. You pulled me from the fire when you had absolutely nothing to gain and everything to lose. You are a woman of immense integrity, staggering intelligence, and undeniable power. You are exactly the kind of person I want sitting across from me at a boardroom table. But more importantly, you are exactly the kind of person I deeply respect. He pauses, letting his gaze sweep over the oblivious family partying inside. My son is a good man, but he is entirely blinded by infatuation. If Chloe is willing to treat her own flesh and blood this viciously just to elevate her social status, she will eventually destroy Julian. She will drain his accounts, ruin his reputation, and poison his life. I cannot allow that to happen. And I will certainly not allow your wretched parents to ride my coattails into high society while treating my savior like absolute garbage. I look at him, realizing exactly what he is silently proposing. The air between us crackles with a dangerous electric energy. We do not need to speak the exact details aloud to understand the devastating magnitude of the trap that has just presented itself. My family is desperately climbing a fragile ladder to reach the Thorn Empire, completely unaware that the woman they are stepping on actually owns the entire scaffolding. Winston extends his right hand toward me, not as a prospective family member, but as an equal titan of industry. We make a silent, bloodless pact right there on the freezing terrace, under the watchful eyes of the city skyline. We will walk back into that glittering ballroom, and we will play our respective parts flawlessly. We will smile, we will nod, and we will let Valerie, Calvin, and Chloe continue digging their own social and financial graves with their gold-plated shovels. We will let their blinding greed and their insatiable arrogance push them right to the absolute edge of the cliff. And when the perfect moment arrives, when they have risked absolutely everything they have to secure this marriage, we will let the entire illusion shatter. I reach out and firmly shake his hand, sealing the fate of my toxic family once and for all. Let the games begin. The heavy glass doors swing shut behind me, sealing the freezing night air out on the terrace, and the immediate transition back into the stifling heat of the ballroom is intensely overwhelming. The scent of expensive roasted meats, imported black truffles, and overwhelmingly sweet white orchids crashes over me like a suffocating wave of manufactured perfection. Winston Thorne and I have just forged an invisible alliance that will systematically dismantle my family's entire existence, but as we re-enter the party, we act as complete strangers. Winston gives me a single imperceptible nod before smoothly blending back into a group of high-powered investors laughing at a joke, as if the profound emotional confession on the terrace never even happened. I smooth the fabric of my simple black dress and begin the long walk back toward my designated dark corner of the room. I do not even make it halfway across the polished hardwood dance floor before my father intercepts me. Calvin moves with the aggressive, lumbering speed of a man who is accustomed to physically intimidating anyone who steps out of his carefully drawn lines. His face is flushed a deep, angry red, contrasting sharply with his crisp white tuxedo shirt and the rigid lines of his tailored suit. He grabs my upper arm with a grip that is entirely bruising and yanks me aggressively behind a massive decorative pillar constructed of white roses, effectively hiding us from the view of the elite guests. He does not ask what Winston wanted. He does not ask if I am all right or if I need anything. He simply glares down at me, his dark eyes burning with a toxic mixture of panic and absolute unadulterated fury. "You ungrateful little wretch," he seethes, his voice vibrating with a barely contained rage that he desperately tries to keep muffled so the nearby socialites will not hear his lack of control. "You actually thought you could use this prestigious night to solicit cheap sympathy from the richest man in the room. I watched Winston pull you outside Zuri. I know exactly what you were trying to do. You were out there begging him for a handout and trying to humiliate your sister in front of her new powerful family." He reaches into the interior breast pocket of his expensive jacket and pulls out a thick black leather billfold. He shoves it roughly against my chest, forcing me to take it to keep it from falling to the polished marble floor. "Since you wanted to make a public spectacle of yourself and nearly ruin the most important night of your sister's entire life, you can make yourself useful," Calvin spits out. He points a thick, heavy finger at the leather folder in my hands, tapping the cover aggressively. "That is the catering bill for the cocktail hour appetizers alone. It is $4,000. Your mother and I have already spent an absolute fortune securing this country club venue and outfitting Chloe for her new elite lifestyle. You are going to march over to the head waiter right now and you are going to pay that tab. Empty out your little piggy bank, Zuri. Consider it a harsh, necessary financial penalty for forgetting your place in this family and embarrassing us in front of the Thorns." I slowly open the leather folder, taking in the crisp white receipt. The itemized list is obnoxiously long, detailing hundreds of miniature beef Wellingtons, imported caviar, blinis, and truffle-infused goat cheese tartlets. It is $4,000 of pure, unadulterated gluttony, meant strictly to impress people who already have entirely too much money. Calvin watches me stare at the staggering total, and a cruel, mocking smile spreads slowly across his rigid face. He actually crosses his arms over his chest, leaning back against the floral pillar with immense, cruel satisfaction. "I know that is probably every single dime you have scraped together cleaning those filthy commercial toilets." He laughs loudly, ensuring his voice carries enough to sting me, but not enough to draw a crowd of concerned onlookers. "It will probably take you an entire calendar year of scrubbing floors on your hands and knees just to pay off what these rich people ate in 45 minutes. But maybe this sharp financial pain will finally teach you not to step out of your designated lane." His callous laughter and the sheer delight he takes in my supposed financial ruin acts as a brutal time machine, pulling my mind backward. The sound of his mocking voice violently transports me back to a freezing, rainy afternoon in November, exactly 10 years ago. I was barely 25 years old, working 2 exhausting minimum wage jobs, and desperately trying to secure my very first apartment. I had finally found a tiny rundown studio in a terrible neighborhood, but I desperately needed a co-signer because I lacked sufficient credit history to secure the lease. I drove my beat-up car to my parents' sprawling suburban estate and humbly asked my father for his signature on a simple piece of paper. I begged him, telling him I had the rent money saved, but just needed his name to satisfy the landlord. He completely refused. He stood on his massive wrap-around porch, looked at my exhausted face, and told me that signing my lease was a poor investment of his valuable time. He told me that coddling me would only breed weakness, and that I needed to learn exactly how the real world crushes people who cannot stand on their own 2 feet. That exact same night, he wrote a massive check to pay for a luxury high-rise condo for Chloe, simply because she did not like sharing a bathroom with her college roommate. I spent the next 3 months living entirely out of my beat-up sedan. I parked under flickering streetlights in abandoned commercial lots, for safety wrapping myself in cheap, thin blankets, while the freezing winter temperatures seeped through the metal doors and settled deep into my aching bones. I washed my face in cold public restrooms and ate cold canned soup while my father proudly bragged to his country club friends about his tough love parenting style. He broke me down financially and emotionally, leaving me to literally freeze in a vehicle just to prove he had absolute power over my physical survival. He wanted me to suffer because my suffering elevated his sense of authority. That specific memory used to bring me to desperate tears, but tonight it only reinforces the absolute brilliance of the trap I am about to spring. I close the leather folder with a soft, definitive snap. I do not argue with him. I do not plead poverty or point out the sheer insanity of forcing a supposed minimum wage sanitation worker to pay a $4,000 catering bill for an engagement party she was actively excluded from planning. I maintain a mask of absolute serene compliance, projecting total defeat. A passing waiter, holding a silver tray of empty crystal champagne flutes, steps near our hidden corner. I politely catch his attention and hand him the heavy leather folder. I calmly open my small, inexpensive clutch purse and retrieve my payment method, placing it smoothly on top of the printed receipt. It is not a standard plastic debit card from a local credit union. It is a solid metal card, sleek matte black and completely devoid of any raised numbers or cheap brightly colored bank logos. It carries a significant physical weight, a heavy, undeniable heft that speaks quietly of exclusive corporate power and unlimited financial resources. The waiter takes the folder, his eyes widening slightly as he registers the heavy metal card and the discreet banking insignia printed on the back. He gives a swift, deeply respectful bow and quickly walks away toward the kitchen to process the massive transaction. My father stares at me, utterly confused by my total lack of emotional resistance. He was desperately craving a screaming match. He wanted me to beg him to reconsider so he could ruthlessly crush me all over again. Before he can interrogate me about my compliance, Chloe suddenly appears from behind the white floral pillar, clinging tightly to Julian's arm. She had been tracking my confrontation with Calvin from across the room, eager to witness my humiliation firsthand. She saw the metallic flash of the heavy black card right before the waiter walked away. Chloe lets out a loud theatrical scoff, rolling her perfectly lined eyes with extreme prejudice. She dramatically leans her head against Julian's expensive suit shoulder and points a perfectly manicured finger directly at my chest. "Oh my God, Julian! Look at what she is doing!" Chloe whispers, her voice entirely too loud and dripping with malicious, venomous delight. Zuri must have actually fallen for one of those predatory credit card scams on the internet. You know, the ones that specifically target desperate low-income people with terrible credit scores? They give them fake heavy metal cards with insane interest rates just to make them feel rich for 5 minutes. She shakes her head, feigning deep sisterly concern, while her dark eyes gleam with pure, calculated wickedness. Mom and Dad are absolutely going to end up bailing her out of bankruptcy again when she defaults on those fancy appetizers. It is so humiliating having a sister who constantly tries to fake a luxury lifestyle she cannot possibly afford. Julian looks at me with a mixture of polite pity and severe discomfort, shifting his weight awkwardly in his polished dress shoes. Calvin simply nods in gruff agreement, completely buying into Chloe's vicious, fabricated narrative. They look at me with absolute supreme disgust, thoroughly convinced I am just a pathetic, desperate fraud drowning in predatory consumer debt. I look back at them, my expression perfectly blank and unreadable. I do not correct Chloe. I do not defend my financial status to Julian or my father. I simply let their arrogant, insulting assumptions wash over me like water off a stone, because they have absolutely no idea what they just confidently witnessed. They do not know that the sleek piece of metal I just handed the waiter is not a personal credit card tied to a ruined credit score. It is a Vanguard Facilities Group executive corporate account card. It is issued exclusively to the sole founder of the company. And it has absolutely no spending limit. I just effortlessly funded their extravagant high society party with absolute pocket change from my massive corporate expense account. The waiter returns a moment later, handing me the receipt with a look of profound newfound respect. I sign my name with a steady, unbothered hand, leaving a massive tip for the catering staff. I slide the heavy black card back into my clutch and lock eyes with my sister. The permanent paper trail has officially begun, and my family is blissfully marching straight into a financial slaughterhouse of their own design. The mandatory Sunday dinner at my parents' sprawling suburban estate is a weekly exercise in psychological endurance. Exactly 7 days have passed since the engagement party, and the heavy tension still hangs in the formal dining room like thick, suffocating smoke. I sit at the far end of the polished mahogany table, staring at my untouched plate of roasted lamb. Calvin sits at the head, slicing his meat with aggressive motions, while Valerie hovers over her wine glass. Chloe sits directly across from me, pushing a cherry tomato around her expensive china plate. Julian is very noticeably absent here tonight, attending a sudden business dinner with his father, leaving me entirely alone in the Viper Pit. I take a slow sip of ice water, maintaining my serene facade. I know Winston is laying the groundwork for our silent pact on his end. My only job tonight is to let my family continue their blind, arrogant march toward the edge of the cliff. The silence is suddenly broken by a loud, dramatic sniffle. Chloe drops her silver fork with a sharp clatter and covers her face with both hands. Her shoulders begin to shake with manufactured sobs. It is a highly rehearsed theatrical performance I have witnessed 1,000 times before. Valerie immediately rushes to her side, placing a comforting hand on her back. Calvin stops cutting his meat and looks at his golden child with gruff concern. Chloe slowly lowers her hands, revealing perfectly dry eyes and a trembling bottom lip. "It is the wedding," she gasps, her voice catching perfectly. "The budget is already running incredibly tight, and we have not even booked the imported floral arrangements yet. Julian's family expects a certain level of elite luxury. Winston has business partners flying in from Dubai and London. If the reception does not look flawless, they will judge us. They will think we are beneath them. I cannot bear humiliating the Thorne family just because we cannot afford the platinum-tier catering package." Calvin shifts uncomfortably in his large leather chair. He has already taken out a massive second mortgage on this house just to cover the initial country club deposits. He is financially drowning trying to keep up appearances, but his immense pride will never allow him to admit that to anyone, let alone the billionaire Thornes. Valerie strokes Chloe's hair and then slowly, deliberately turns her head to look directly at me. Her dark eyes narrow into a vicious, calculated glare. The artificial maternal warmth vanishes completely, replaced by a freezing, absolute contempt. She does not see a daughter sitting at her dining table. She sees a convenient scapegoat and an untapped resource. "Your sister is sitting here crying," Zuri Valerie says, her voice dropping into a venomous hiss. She is crumbling under the immense pressure of planning the most important social event this family has ever seen, and you are just sitting there staring at your plate. You have absolutely no empathy. You have no sense of familial duty. You handed that waiter a heavy metal credit card last week without blinking an eye. We all saw it. If you have somehow scammed your way into a high-limit line of credit, you are going to use it to help your sister right now. I set my water glass down on the table, my movements slow and deliberate. I do not owe Chloe anything. I state, my voice calm and devoid of any emotional reaction. I am not funding a wedding. I am not even participating in. Calvin slams his fist onto the mahogany table, rattling the expensive crystal glasses. "You owe her everything." He booms, his face flushing a deep, angry crimson. "You owe this entire family for dragging our name through the mud with your pathetic minimum wage lifestyle. But more importantly, you owe your sister for completely ruining her 16th birthday." I close my eyes for a fraction of a second, bracing myself entirely. It is their favorite fabricated weapon. A completely manufactured memory they have weaponized against me for over a decade. When Chloe turned 16, Valerie and Calvin threw her a lavish party at a local boutique hotel. They hired a professional DJ and booked an expensive catering company that never showed up. The owner of the catering company had mixed up the dates on his calendar, leaving a room full of hungry teenagers with absolutely no food. Valerie was completely humiliated in front of the other suburban mothers. Instead of blaming the caterer, she decided to blame me for the disaster. I was 19 years old, working a grueling double shift at a local greasy diner just to pay for my community college textbooks. I was not even at the party. I had absolutely nothing to do with the catering arrangements. But Valerie told everyone that I had deliberately sabotaged the confirmation call out of sheer bitter jealousy because I never had a sweet 16 party of my own. They spun a vicious lie claiming I had called the caterer, pretending to be Valerie, and canceled the order just to make Chloe cry. They repeated that lie so many times over. Over the years, they actually began to believe it themselves. It became cemented into the official family lore. Zuri, the jealous villain. Zuri, the bitter older sister who tried to destroy Chloe's special day. They used that fabricated story to justify excluding me from family vacations and to justify treating me like an indentured servant. They created a permanent psychological debt that I could never possibly repay. You deliberately broke your sister's heart when she was just a teenager, Valerie adds, leaning over the table toward me. You humiliated us in front of the entire neighborhood because of pure spite. You could not handle the fact that she was popular and loved. You owe her this wedding, Zuri. You owe her those floral arrangements. You are going to take out whatever cash advances you can on that predatory scam card you showed off last week, and you are going to hand the money directly to me. I look at Valerie, and then I look at Calvin. I do not raise my voice. I do not try to defend myself against the sweet 16 lie because I know facts hold absolutely no power in this house. No, I say, keeping perfectly flat. I am not paying for imported orchids. I am not taking out any cash advances. The conversation is over. I calmly push my chair back from the table, preparing to stand up and walk out the front door. I have played my part for the evening. I have let them expose their blinding greed. But Valerie does not accept my quiet defiance. She operates on absolute control, and my refusal triggers a sudden manic snap in her mind. Before I can fully stand up, she lunges around the large mahogany table, moving with an aggressive speed fueled by pure, unadulterated entitlement. She steps directly behind my chair, invading my physical space. My small, black clutch purse is resting on the back of my seat, exactly where I placed it when I arrived. Valerie reaches out and physically snatches my purse, her acrylic nails scraping harshly against the leather. Give that back to me right now, I demand, keeping my voice dangerously low as I turn to face her. Valerie ignores me completely. Her breathing is heavy and erratic as she violently yanks the golden clasp open. She digs her manicured fingers into the small interior of the bag. She shoves my keys and lip gloss aside. You live under my rules, Zuri, she seethes, her eyes wide with a frantic, desperate energy. You do not get to walk away from your debts to this family. If you have a credit line, you are going to use it to secure Chloe's future. I could easily grab her wrist. I could physically force the purse out of her hands. I have survived working the overnight sanitation shifts in the worst industrial zones of Atlanta. I am significantly stronger than my socialite mother, but I remember the silent pact with Winston. We let them dig their own graves. We let their blinding arrogance push them right to the edge of the cliff. So I freeze. I let my hands drop to my sides, and I watch her commit the ultimate fatal error. Valerie pulls out the heavy matte black card. She holds it up to the chandelier. She assumes it is a cheap predatory credit card issued to a desperate floor cleaner. She thinks it has a $1,000 limit. She turns away, completely dismissing my presence, and walks directly over to her golden child. Here, sweetheart, Valerie says, handing it over. You book the best white orchids. Chloe takes the card, entirely entranced by the sudden purchasing power. She holds the sleek black card tightly, completely unaware that she is actually holding a Vanguard corporate card with no spending limit whatsoever. The mandatory Sunday dinner is a suffocating tradition my mother enforces with the strict discipline of a military dictator. Exactly 7 days have passed since the engagement party at the country club. I sit at the dining table inside my parents' mortgaged suburban home, staring down at a plate of overcooked roast lamb. The silence in the room is thick and suffocating, punctuated only by the aggressive scraping of Calvin's steak knife against his fine china. Valerie sits at the opposite end of the table, nursing her third glass of expensive red wine, her eyes darting nervously toward my sister. Chloe has barely touched her food. She is currently staring at her diamond engagement ring, resting her chin on her hand, and practicing a look of profound despair. I take a slow sip of my water, waiting for the theatrical performance to begin. I do not have to wait long. A perfectly timed tear rolls down Chloe's contoured cheek. She lets out a shuddering breath and pushes her untouched plate away with dramatic flair. Calvin immediately drops his knife, his face twisting into an expression of deep paternal concern. "What is wrong, sweetheart?" he asks, his voice dripping with affection he has never directed toward me. Chloe covers her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking as she begins to sob loudly. It is the budget, she wails, peering through her fingers to ensure she has a captive audience. Julian's family is expecting a luxury event. Winston's business associates will all be there. The wedding planner just sent over the revised estimates for the floral arrangements and the imported silk table linens, and we are completely short. We do not have enough money to give the Thorns the kind of high society wedding they expect, and Julian will be humiliated. Valerie slams her wine glass down so hard the red liquid sloshes over the rim and stains the white tablecloth. She rushes over to Chloe, wrapping her arms around her golden child and glaring directly across at me. This is exactly what I was terrified of. Valerie hisses, her eyes blazing with fury. "We are doing everything we can to secure your future, Chloe, but we are stretched entirely too thin. Calvin and I have completely drained our savings just to cover the venue deposit. We cannot take out another bank loan without risking this house." Valerie slowly lifts her head, and her furious gaze locks onto my face. Her voice drops to a venomous, demanding register. "But your sister is not going to suffer because our family is lacking resources. It is finally time for you to step up, Zuri, and contribute something meaningful to this family for once." I meet my mother's furious glare with absolute calm. I slowly place my linen napkin on the table, deliberately refusing to take the emotional bait. I do not have the financial resources to fund a luxury wedding, I state, keeping my voice level and detached. I am an independent adult, paying for my own living expenses. I will not be contributing to silk table linens or imported floral arrangements. The words hang in the dining room air, heavy with quiet defiance. Calvin slams his large fists onto the table, rattling the silver utensils. "You owe her." Calvin bellows, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. "You owe your sister for the humiliation you caused her, and it is time you paid your debt." Valerie steps away from Chloe and marches directly toward my side of the table, her acrylic nails digging into the high wooden back of my chair. "You owe Chloe for ruining her 16th birthday," Valerie sneers, her breath smelling sharply of fermented grapes. "You ruined the most important milestone of her teenage life, and you have never done a single thing to make up for it." The sheer audacity of the accusation hits me like a physical blow, instantly pulling my mind backward into the dark, suffocating well of my childhood memories. It is a completely fabricated historical narrative they have aggressively weaponized against me for over a decade. I am immediately transported back to the sweltering, humid morning of Chloe's sweet 16 party. Valerie had spent 3 months bragging to the entire neighborhood about the lavish, catered event she was throwing in our backyard. She tasked me, an exhausted teenager holding down an after-school job, with physically taking the cash deposit to the local catering company. But Valerie never actually gave me the cash. She spent the catering deposit on a new designer handbag for herself, and conveniently feigned ignorance when the caterers simply never showed up to the party. 50 hungry teenagers stood in our backyard while Valerie loudly and publicly blamed me, screaming that I must have lost the money due to my severe incompetence. She completely humiliated me in front of the entire neighborhood, actively shifting her own selfish financial irresponsibility directly onto my young shoulders. I spent that entire weekend locked in my bedroom crying until I could not breathe while my parents bought Chloe a new car to compensate for the ruined party. They rewrote history that day, casting me as the ultimate villain to protect Valerie's fragile ego. The phantom weight of that childhood injustice slowly fades, bringing me sharply back to the present reality of the dining room. I look up at my mother, refusing to blink. "That is a fabricated lie, and you know it." I say, my voice ringing with a cold, hard authority that startles my parents. I will not pay a single dime for this wedding based on a delusional memory you created to cover up your own massive failures. Chloe lets out a loud shriek of pure indignation from across the table. She is lying. Chloe screams, pointing her manicured finger at me. She always lies. She is just a selfish, miserable failure who wants to ruin my wedding because she is jealous of my success. Make her pay for it, Mom. Make her give us the money right now. Valerie's face twists into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She does not argue with me anymore. She bypasses verbal negotiation entirely and resorts to immediate physical violation. Before I register her movement, Valerie lunges forward and physically snatches my leather purse. She pulls it straight from the back of my dining chair. I jump up, reaching out to stop her, but Calvin immediately steps into my path, using his massive bulk to block me from reaching my mother. Sit back down and keep your mouth shut, Calvin growls, stepping into my personal space. You are going to help your sister whether you want to or not. I stand perfectly still, watching in absolute silent horror as my mother violently rips open the zipper of my personal bag. She aggressively digs her hands through my belongings, tossing my keys, my lipstick, and my private items carelessly onto the dining room table. She is breathing heavily, acting with the manic desperation of a cornered animal seeking a lifeline. Then her searching fingers stop. She pulls out the sleek, heavy black metal corporate card I used at the country club exactly 7 days ago. The very same Vanguard Facilities Group executive card that possesses absolutely no spending limit. She holds it up to the dining room chandelier, the matte black metal catching the warm ambient light. Look at this. Valerie breathes a triumphant, greedy smile splitting across her face. Chloe was right about you falling for a predatory credit card scam. If you have the credit limit to pay off a $4,000 catering bill, you certainly have the funds to pay for your sister's imported floral arrangements. Valerie does not hand the heavy black card back to me. She turns her back, completely ignoring my presence, and walks directly over to the golden child. She places the limitless Vanguard corporate card directly into Chloe's eager, waiting hands. Consider this an early wedding present from your useless sister Valerie, says, smoothing Chloe's hair with sickening affection. Take it and buy whatever you need. Buy everything to impress Julian's father. Buy the silk linens. Buy the imported orchids. Buy the absolute best of everything. We will max out this entire line of credit before she even realizes what happened. Chloe clutches the heavy metal card against her chest, staring at it like it is a winning lottery ticket. A slow, malicious smile spreads across her face, replacing the fake tears instantly. Thank you so much, Zuri. Chloe mocks, her voice dripping with venomous condescension. I am going to have the wedding planner run this card first thing tomorrow morning. I hope you enjoy paying for my wedding for the rest of your pathetic life. I stand silently behind my chair, watching them celebrate their stolen victory. They believe they have successfully bullied a vulnerable victim into financing their social climbing facade. They have absolutely no idea they are currently holding the direct corporate financial artery of a $50 million empire. The moment they run an unauthorized charge on a Vanguard executive account, they will trigger a massive federal fraud investigation. I smile softly. Enjoy the wedding planning, Chloe. Valerie stands with her chin tilted upward, radiating a toxic brand of maternal triumph. She watches Chloe trace the raised edges of the heavy metal card, her eyes gleaming with predatory satisfaction. Zuri can contribute to her sister's happiness. For once, Valerie declares, breaking the tense silence of the dining room. She stares directly at me, daring me to lunge across the polished mahogany table and snatch my property back. It is the absolute least she can do, since she will clearly never have a wedding of her own. The insult is designed to cut deeply, highlighting my supposed failure in the romantic arena compared to Chloe's high society engagement. Calvin immediately shifts his massive weight, nodding in gruff agreement with his wife. He steps forward, positioning his broad shoulders between me and his golden child. He is silently daring me to cause a scene, to scream, or throw the temper tantrum they are desperately trying to provoke. They want me to lose control so they can validate their twisted narrative that I am the unstable, jealous sibling. They want me to fight for the card so they can revel in my supposed financial desperation. I remain completely stoic. I do not let a single muscle in my face twitch. My breathing is steady and shallow. I look at the three people who share my DNA, and I feel absolutely nothing. No anger, no betrayal, no heartbreak. The sheer absence of emotion is incredibly powerful. I learned a long time ago that showing vulnerability to these people is akin to bleeding in shark-infested waters. I recall the exact moment I made a solemn, unbreakable promise to myself that I would never shed another tear over their calculated cruelty. It was a humid Saturday afternoon, precisely 7 years ago. I was standing in a massive university auditorium wearing a cheap rented graduation gown and holding my freshly printed bachelor's degree in business administration. I spent 4 grueling years working night shifts and maintaining a perfect grade point average to earn that paper. I stood in the center of the bustling crowd watching hundreds of my classmates embrace their proud, cheering parents. I searched the bleachers for Valerie and Calvin. I waited 2 entire hours, clutching my degree until the auditorium was completely empty. When I walked to the parking lot and checked my cell phone, I found a single text message from my mother. It was not an apology, it was a photograph. The image showed Valerie, Calvin, and Chloe smiling brightly at a local chain restaurant. The caption announced they were celebrating Chloe receiving a minor participation trophy at her cheerleading banquet. They'd deliberately chosen a meaningless high school dinner over my college graduation. They had let me stand in that auditorium completely alone, searching for a family that never intended to show up. I sat in my sedan, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, and made a vow. I promised to build an armor so thick and a life so untouchable that their malicious neglect would never penetrate my peace again. I buried the desperate daughter who wanted her parents to love her, and I birthed the ruthless entrepreneur who would eventually build Vanguard Facilities Group. The phantom sting of that graduation day officially vanishes from my mind, bringing me back to the suffocating atmosphere of the dining room. Valerie is still glaring at me, waiting for the inevitable explosion. Calvin is still bracing his body for a physical altercation over the stolen property. Chloe is already holding the card up to the light, admiring the sleek, matte black finish. I look directly into my mother's eyes and let a calm smile spread across my face. I do not shout. I do not demand my property back. I simply reach forward and gather my violated purse from the back of the chair. I methodically place my keys and my lipstick back into the leather bag, zipping it shut with a smooth, decisive motion. "Keep it," I say, my voice dropping to a low register that echoes against the dining room walls. "Buy the imported orchids, Chloe. Buy the expensive silk linens. Make sure you impress Julian's family. You absolutely deserve everything that is coming to you." My calm surrender instantly confuses the entire room. Calvin's heavy shoulders drop his aggressive posture, faltering as he tries to decipher my lack of resistance. Valerie narrows her eyes, her triumphant smile wavering slightly at the edges. She expected a desperate fight for what she assumes is a predatory high-interest credit card. She did not expect a serene, terrifyingly calm retreat. Chloe is completely oblivious to the shifting energy in the room. She squeals with delight, clutching the Vanguard corporate card against her chest, completely ignoring the heavy tension radiating from her parents. I do not wait for Valerie to formulate another insult. I turn my back on my family and walk slowly toward the front door. The sound of my steady footsteps on the hardwood floor feels like a steady drumbeat marking the beginning of their ultimate downfall. I step out onto the front porch, closing the heavy door behind me, sealing them inside their own impending destruction. The crisp evening air hits my face, clearing away the stifling, toxic atmosphere of my childhood home. I walk down the concrete driveway toward my parked car, my mind instantly shifting gears. The obedient, silent daughter officially ceases to exist, and the chief executive officer of Vanguard Facilities Group takes absolute control. I slide into the driver's seat of my vehicle, locking the doors and starting the engine. The interior of the car is quiet, offering a perfect sanctuary for the execution of my strategy. I do not drive away immediately. Instead, I reach into my center console and retrieve my encrypted corporate smartphone. I quickly navigate to my contacts and press the direct emergency line for Marcus Sterling, the brilliant and ruthless Chief Financial Officer of Vanguard. Marcus answers on the second ring, his voice sharp and alert despite the late hour on a Sunday evening. "Zuri," he says, his tone strictly professional. "Is everything all right?" "Everything is perfectly fine, Marcus," I reply, leaning back against the leather headrest and watching the warm light glowing from my parents' dining room window. "I need you to initiate a highly specific protocol regarding my primary executive expense account. The physical card was just removed from my possession by a third party." I hear the immediate sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "I will freeze the account right now, Zuri. I will flag it for theft and dispatch corporate security. Do not freeze the account, Marcus." I command, my voice cutting through his panic with absolute icy precision. "I want you to leave the card entirely active. I want you to completely authorize any and all upcoming charges made on that specific physical card, regardless of the vendor or the staggering dollar amount. Let every single transaction process without a single security hold or fraud alert." There is a long, heavy pause on the line as my chief financial officer processes the highly unusual directive. He knows me well enough to understand that I do not make reckless financial decisions. He knows there is a deadly tactical reason behind my request. "You want me to let a stolen card run freely on the primary corporate account?" he asks, his voice dropping to a low, serious whisper. "Yes," I confirm, watching the silhouettes of my family moving behind the drawn curtains of their suburban home. "But I want you to silently tag every single transaction for a comprehensive internal audit. I want our forensic accounting team to track every vendor, every signature, every timestamp, and every IP address associated with that card starting tomorrow morning. Build a flawless, bulletproof paper trail. I want a digital mountain of irrefutable evidence." "Understood," Marcus replies, the fierce intelligence in his voice matching my own. "We will track every penny. We will compile a complete forensic dossier of felony commercial fraud." I end the call and toss the phone onto the passenger seat. I look up at the house one last time. Chloe is probably already online loading up her virtual shopping carts with luxury items using a corporate card she believes is tied to my personal ruined credit. Valerie is pouring herself another glass of wine, wildly celebrating her tactical victory over her perceived failure of a daughter. Calvin is likely bragging about how he successfully put me in my place. They have absolutely no idea that they are not spending my personal meager savings. They are currently committing federal wire fraud and grand larceny against a $50 million commercial enterprise. The trap is officially set, and the permanent paper trail for their total destruction has begun. I shift the car into gear and drive away into the cold, dark night, leaving them alone with the sleek black card that will soon become their ultimate financial guillotine. Exactly 60 days have passed since the night my mother handed my sister the keys to a financial kingdom she did not earn. 2 months of absolute, unadulterated gluttony. 2 months of my Vanguard corporate account dashboard lighting up with an endless stream of exorbitant charges. I have watched quietly from the shadows as Chloe morphed from a spoiled suburban princess into a manic creature entirely consumed by greed. Every alert on my secure phone documented her descent into a felony fraud of spectacular proportions. Today, the paper trail culminates at Winston Thorne's sprawling private estate for the rehearsal dinner. Walking through the massive wrought iron gates of the property, I am immediately assaulted by the sheer scale of my sister's stolen extravagance. The manicured lawns have been transformed into a grotesque display of forced opulence. A live string quartet is positioned on a raised mahogany platform, playing classical arrangements to a crowd of people who are barely listening. The evening air is crisp, but the pathways are lined with towering, intricate ice sculptures, carved into the shapes of swans and intertwined rings, slowly weeping water onto the pristine stone walkways. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos circulate with silver platters piled high with imported beluga caviar and gold leaf-infused blinis. It is a nauseating spectacle of newly acquired wealth, desperately trying to masquerade as established class. Chloe has spared absolutely zero expense, thoroughly convinced she is spending the fraudulent limits of my supposedly ruined credit. She does not know that Vanguard forensic accountants have tracked every single imported orchid and every ounce of caviar right back to her IP address. I move silently through the crowd of Julian's elite friends, blending into the background of the lavish garden party. I am wearing a simple, understated charcoal dress that allows me to become practically invisible among the sea of sequins and designer silk. From my vantage point near a towering oak tree, I have a perfect view of the evening's main attraction. Chloe is holding court near the center of the terrace, completely intoxicated by the power of her stolen black card. She is wearing a custom-fitted pearl white gown that shimmers under the ambient string lights, laughing too loudly and gesturing wildly with a champagne flute. She is actively flaunting the purchased grandeur to a group of Julian's closest friends, desperately seeking their validation. I watch her wave a hand dismissively toward a passing waiter, demanding a fresh glass of vintage champagne without even bothering to look the young man in the eye. Julian stands rigidly beside her. The golden boy of the Thorne family is historically accustomed to quiet luxury. His family possesses the kind of immense generational wealth that never needs to shout because it has nothing left to prove. Watching Chloe aggressively broadcast her purchase status is having a profound and highly visible effect on him. I watch the subtle tightening of his jaw and the stiff, uncomfortable set of his broad shoulders. He shifts his weight constantly, his polite smile failing to reach his dark eyes. Every time Chloe brags about the cost of the imported floral arrangements or loudly complains about the temperature of the expensive catered appetizers, Julian winces. It is a micro-expression barely noticeable to the untrained eye, but I have spent my entire life studying the shifting dynamics of predators and prey. Julian is deeply embarrassed. His refined high society friends are nodding politely at Chloe's endless monologues, but their eyes hold a distinct mixture of pity and condescension. They see right through her aggressive posturing. They recognize the frantic desperation of a woman trying to buy her way into a world she fundamentally does not understand. Chloe takes a large gulp of champagne and leans heavily against Julian's arm, giggling at a joke no one else found particularly amusing. Julian gently but deliberately steps back, creating a small but undeniable physical distance between them. The subtle rejection hangs heavily in the humid night air. Chloe stumbles slightly, her high heels scraping against the stone patio as she loses her anchor. She looks up at her fiancé, her perfectly contoured face flashing with a sudden sharp panic. She is highly attuned to the social currency of the room, and she instantly recognizes that she is losing her grip on her most valuable asset. Julian is pulling away. The realization hits her like a physical blow. She desperately needs to recalibrate the social hierarchy of the party to regain her footing and assert her absolute dominance. She needs a scapegoat. She needs someone to punch down on so she can artificially elevate herself back to the top of the pedestal. Chloe scans the crowded terrace, her eyes darting frantically past the ice sculptures and the string quartet. She ignores the wealthy investors and the high-powered executives. She is hunting for a target she knows she can completely destroy without any fear of retaliation. Her frantic gaze sweeps past the catering stations and the massive floral archways until her eyes finally lock onto my dark corner near the oak tree. A slow, malicious smile spreads across her face, instantly replacing the panic with pure, calculated cruelty. She straightens her spine, pushing her shoulders back and lifting her chin with supreme, arrogant confidence. I know exactly what she is about to do. I take a slow, measured sip of my sparkling water, maintaining a completely blank and unreadable expression. I do not break eye contact as she begins to march across the stone patio, her white gown trailing behind her like a bridal war banner. Julian notices her sudden shift in demeanor and tries to catch her arm, but she brushes past him, completely ignoring his attempt to de-escalate. She signals for her parents to follow her. Valerie and Calvin immediately fall into step behind their golden child, functioning as her loyal, aggressive bodyguards. They march through the crowd, parting the sea of elite guests with their sheer obnoxious momentum. The surrounding conversations slowly die down as the high society guests sense the impending conflict. The string quartet continues to play a soft, classical melody, providing a surreal, elegant soundtrack to the brutal family ambush about to take place. Chloe stops exactly 3 feet in front of me, planting her hands on her hips and looking me up and down with absolute supreme disgust. She lets out a loud theatrical sigh, making sure her voice carries clearly over the gentle music. "I cannot believe you actually showed up tonight, Zuri," she says, her voice dripping with artificial pity and venomous condescension. She turns her head slightly, ensuring Julian and his influential friends are watching the performance. "I mean, look at you. You are wearing a cheap department store rag to the most exclusive event of the entire season. It is honestly embarrassing to be seen in the same zip code as you." Valerie steps up beside her daughter, nodding in furious agreement. "We explicitly told you to stay hidden in the background," Valerie sneers, her eyes flashing with malice. "But you always have to ruin everything with your miserable, depressing energy." Calvin crosses his massive arms over his chest, trying to physically intimidate me with his sheer size. "You should be thanking your sister on your hands and knees for even allowing you onto this property." Calvin growls, his voice low and threatening. "She graciously let you experience a taste of real luxury, and you show up looking like a complete and utter failure." Chloe smiles triumphantly, absorbing their toxic support like a sponge. She takes another step closer to me, her diamond engagement ring catching the light as she points a manicured finger directly at my chest. "I hope you are taking notes tonight, Zuri," she mocks, her voice ringing with absolute cruel authority. "I hope you are paying close attention to what a real successful woman looks like, because we both know you will never have a wedding like this. You will never have a man like Julian. You will never have anything but a pathetic, lonely life, scrubbing floors and drowning in the massive consumer debt you owe me." She tilts her head back, daring me to challenge her fabricated reality. She wants me to scream. She wants me to cry. She wants me to publicly break down and validate her desperate need for supreme dominance. But I simply look at her, maintaining my absolute silence, letting her dig her own grave. She craves the satisfaction of watching me shatter into a million broken pieces right in front of her future husband. She is entirely dependent on my emotional devastation to fuel her own deeply insecure existence. Julian steps up behind her, his face completely pale as he stares at the sheer, unprovoked viciousness radiating from the woman he promised to marry. He looks at my calm, unbothered expression and then back at Chloe's twisted, malicious smile. The invisible trap I set 2 months ago is snapping shut. The suffocating tension hanging in the air is mercifully broken by the soft chiming of crystal glasses signaling the commencement of the main course. The elite guests begin to filter away from the garden terrace and move slowly toward the grand dining pavilion. Winston Thorne has truly spared no expense in constructing this magnificent architectural marvel on his private estate. The pavilion features towering floor-to-ceiling glass walls, massive crystal chandeliers, and imported pristine white Italian marble floors that reflect the warm ambient light like a flawless mirror. The dining tables are arranged in a massive U-shape, draped in the imported silk linens Chloe so eagerly purchased with my corporate funds. I follow the crowd, maintaining a deliberate distance from my family, and find my designated seat at the absolute furthest corner of the room. It is a seating placement designed for maximum isolation, placing me near the swinging doors of the catering kitchen, where the waitstaff frantically rushes in and out. I sit down, smoothing the fabric of my inexpensive charcoal dress, and watch the grotesque performance continue from afar. Chloe places herself directly at the center of the head table, flanked by Julian and his powerful father. She looks like a radiant, conquering queen, presiding over a kingdom she believes she has rightfully earned. Valerie and Calvin sit proudly nearby, their chests puffed out, as they mingle with influential politicians and corporate titans they could never hope to meet in their normal suburban lives. The waitstaff begins serving the extravagant main course, delivering plates of perfectly seared filet mignon and butter-poached lobster tails. Chloe continues to dominate the conversation, her voice rising above the polite hum of the room. She is desperately trying to captivate a table of Winston's oldest business partners, wildly exaggerating her own professional accomplishments and bragging about the sheer cost of the lavish rehearsal dinner. I watched Julian carefully. His earlier discomfort has mutated into a rigid, suffocating silence. He is pushing his food around his plate with a heavy silver fork completely disengaged from his fiancée's manic monologues. Every time Chloe loudly drops the price of a floral arrangement or snaps her fingers to summon a waiter, Julian visibly recoils. He is a man raised in a world where talking about money is considered the ultimate display of low-class desperation. Chloe lacks the generational refinement to understand that her aggressive boasting is actively repulsing the exact people she is trying to impress. She notices his stony silence, and her eyes dart around the table, registering the polite but incredibly strained smiles of the Thorne family guests. The panic I saw on the terrace returns, flashing violently in her dark eyes. She realizes she is losing the audience. She needs a grand gesture. She needs to assert her absolute dominance and prove to this room of billionaires that she possesses the inherent power to command and control. Her manic gaze sweeps across the massive dining pavilion, passing over the crystal centerpieces and the imported orchids, until she finds me sitting quietly in my shadowy corner. I know instantly that she has locked onto her target. She reaches out with a perfectly manicured hand and wraps her fingers around the neck of a freshly opened bottle of vintage reserve red wine. It is a tremendously expensive bottle, easily costing several $1,000s, charged directly to the Vanguard corporate account, currently under federal audit. Chloe stands up from her chair, holding the heavy glass bottle. She does not pour a glass. She turns her body slightly, making sure she has the attention of the entire head table. With a sudden, aggressive sweep of her arm, she deliberately knocks the full bottle off the edge of the table. The heavy glass shatters against Winston Thorne's pristine, imported white marble floor with a loud, violent crash. The sound echoes sharply through the glass pavilion, instantly silencing the polite conversations and causing the string quartet to falter. A massive pool of dark red liquid spreads rapidly across the flawless white stone, looking exactly like a fresh, violent wound. The entire room goes dead silent, holding its collective breath. A young, terrified busboy holding a silver tray immediately rushes forward to clean the mess, his face pale with panic. Chloe shoots out her hand and aggressively stops the boy in his tracks. She reaches onto his silver tray and snatches a damp, dirty bar towel meant for wiping down the kitchen stations. She turns her body, completely ignoring the paralyzed waitstaff, and locks her eyes on me from across the room. She rears her arm back and violently hurls the damp, dirty bar towel directly at my face. The heavy, wet cloth sails through the air and strikes me squarely in the chest, leaving a damp, dark stain on the fabric of my dress before dropping into my lap. I do not flinch. I do not gasp. I sit completely paralyzed by the sheer, unadulterated audacity of her public assault. "Zuri, do your job." Chloe commands, her voice ringing out with supreme, arrogant authority, echoing clearly across the silent dining room. "We cannot have this staining Winston's beautiful floor. Clean it up right now." A wave of profound, absolute horror washes over the faces of the high society guests. Winston Thorne drops his heavy cloth napkin, his jaw clenching in tight fury at the blatant display of cruelty unfolding in his home. But my parents do not share the room's collective disgust. I look past Chloe and see Valerie and Calvin sitting comfortably in their chairs. They are not shocked. They are not stepping forward to defend their youngest daughter from public humiliation. Instead, Valerie gives a slow, approving nod, her eyes gleaming with toxic satisfaction. Calvin crosses his arms over his chest, leaning back with a smug, arrogant smile. They are perfectly comfortable watching me being treated like the lowest form of hired help because this is exactly the dynamic they have cultivated behind closed doors for my entire life. They have always positioned me as the eternal servant, the designated scapegoat, meant to clean up the messes my sister deliberately creates. They want me on my knees scrubbing the floor in front of 50 elite strangers so they can validate their own twisted superiority. I look down at the dirty bar towel resting in my lap. The damp fabric seeps cold water through my dress, chilling my skin. I do not move to pick it up. I maintain my absolute stoic composure, focusing my mind entirely on the sleek black Vanguard card resting inside Chloe's clutch purse. Let her enjoy this fleeting momentary high. Let her revel in the false power she feels right now. Every single person in this room is witnessing her true character, and the forensic accounting team is simultaneously documenting every single felony she commits. The heavy silence in the pavilion is suddenly shattered by the sharp, aggressive screech of a wooden chair violently pushing back against the marble floor. Julian stands up. His face is completely drained of color, contrasting sharply with the dark, tailored lines of his expensive tuxedo. His hands are balled into tight, white-knuckled fists at his sides. He looks at the shattered glass, the spreading pool of red wine, and the dirty towel resting in my lap. A look of absolute visceral disgust twists his handsome features. He does not look at Chloe. He completely bypasses his fiancée and steps forward, abandoning the head table entirely. He walks purposefully toward my dark corner of the room, his expensive leather shoes stepping carefully around the spreading red stain. He reaches his hand out, clearly intending to take the dirty towel from my lap and help me stand up. Before he can take another step, Chloe lunges forward. She grabs his forearm, her sharp acrylic nails digging aggressively into the fine fabric of his tuxedo jacket. She yanks him backward, preventing him from reaching me. Her face is flushed with manic, angry energy, completely desperate to maintain her absolute control over the narrative she is forcing onto the room. "Do not ruin your suit, babe!" Chloe snaps, her voice tight with venomous panic and condescending authority. She tightens her grip on his arm, glaring down at me with supreme disgust. This is what she is used to. She does this for a living. Leave her down there where she belongs. Julian freezes. He slowly turns his head, looking down at the manicured hand digging into his arm, and then looks up into Chloe's face. The polite, refined mask he has worn all evening completely shatters. He stares at the woman he promised to marry, the woman he believed was a sweet, innocent victim of a cruel, jealous sibling, and he finally sees the terrifying, malicious reality standing right in front of him. The absolute silence in the dining pavilion stretches out, becoming a heavy, suffocating weight that presses down on the entire Thorne family. Julian looks from Chloe to the approving, smug faces of Valerie and Calvin, and then back to my perfectly calm, unbothered expression. The illusion is broken, and the catastrophic unraveling of Chloe's entire carefully constructed high society life has officially begun. The heavy silence in the dining pavilion is a tangible force pressing against the glass walls. I do not look at Julian, whose face is currently frozen in a mask of absolute horrified realization. I do not look at my mother, whose eyes are shining with a toxic, victorious gleam. I simply look down at the imported white Italian marble floor and the spreading pool of expensive vintage red wine. I slowly lower myself to my knees. The cold, hard stone sends a sharp chill through my bare legs, but I do not flinch. I take the dirty, damp bar towel that Chloe hurled at my chest and place it carefully over the dark red stain. I press my hands flat against the rough fabric, absorbing the liquid with slow, methodical movements. The rich, intoxicating scent of the wine rises in the air, masking the smell of the imported orchids. Around me, 50 of the most powerful people in the country are holding their collective breath. Billionaires, politicians, and elite socialites watch in paralyzed shock as a woman in a charcoal dress kneels on a marble floor, performing manual labor at a high society rehearsal dinner. Chloe lets out a sharp, breathless laugh, a sound completely devoid of actual humor. She expects me to shatter. She wants me to scream, hurl the soaked towel back at her face, and run out of the glass pavilion in tears. Calvin shifts his massive weight, cracking his knuckles with a quiet, intimidating pop. Valerie takes a slow, satisfied sip of her own wine, gazing down at my kneeling form like a monarch observing a conquered peasant. They are entirely comfortable with this grotesque display of public humiliation. They thrive on it. They feed on the absolute destruction of my dignity to artificially inflate their own sense of pathetic superiority. This is the exact dynamic they have desperately tried to enforce since I was a child, and they are banking on my complete emotional collapse to validate their delusions in front of an audience of billionaires. My parents misinterpret my absolute silence for total unconditional defeat. As I drag the heavy wet towel across the pristine stone floor, wiping away the last remnants of the spilled wine, I know exactly what they are thinking. They believe they have successfully broken my spirit. They believe the sheer weight of this public degradation has finally crushed my resistance and forced me to accept my designated role as the family failure. It is the exact same arrogant miscalculation they made on a freezing Tuesday night when I was exactly 18 years old. I remember the sharp, biting wind tearing through my thin jacket as I stood on the front porch of their suburban home. Valerie had found a single college brochure for a state university hidden under my mattress. She flew into a manic rage, screaming that I was an ungrateful parasite trying to steal focus from Chloe's upcoming high school prom. Calvin did not even ask for an explanation. He simply grabbed the back of my neck, marched me to the front door, and threw me down the concrete steps. He tossed 2 black plastic trash bags filled with my clothes onto the wet lawn. Valerie stood in the doorway, her arms crossed over her chest, sneering down at me with absolute contempt. They expected me to beg for forgiveness. They expected me to fall to my knees, bang my fists against the heavy oak door, and plead for a warm bed. They wanted to strip away my dignity before generously allowing me back inside as their obedient servant. But I did not shed a single tear that night. I picked up those black plastic trash bags, turned my back on my childhood home, and walked exactly 4 miles in the freezing rain to a 24-hour diner. I sat in a vinyl booth drinking black coffee and plotting the absolute foundation of an empire. My silence then was not a surrender or a defeat. It was the birth of an absolute ruthless, unyielding determination. My silence now is the exact same tactical weapon. I absorb the final drops of the vintage red wine into the dirty bar towel. The white Italian marble floor is perfectly clean, leaving absolutely no trace of Chloe's violent, unprovoked outburst. I gather the heavily soaked fabric in my hands, gripping it tightly to prevent any dark red liquid from dripping back onto the pristine stone. I slowly rise to my feet. The physical movement is graceful, steady, and completely devoid of the shame my family so desperately wants me to exhibit. I stand tall, smoothing the front of my charcoal dress, ignoring the large damp stain blooming across the fabric over my chest. I hold the ruined bar towel at my side, my posture radiating an impenetrable, commanding authority that instantly clashes with my forced role as the hired help. Julian is standing exactly 3 feet away from me, entirely paralyzed by a potent mixture of profound disgust and horrifying realization. His eyes are locked onto the dark stain on my dress, his jaw working silently as he struggles to process the sheer magnitude of the monstrous behavior he just witnessed. He pulls his arm forcefully out of Chloe's grasping hands, stepping backward as if her physical touch burns his skin. Chloe realizes her severe tactical error immediately. The smug, victorious smile slides off her face, replaced by a frantic, desperate panic. She looks around the massive dining pavilion, desperately trying to read the room. The billionaires and corporate titans are not laughing with her. They are not nodding in agreement with her bizarre display of dominance. They are staring at her with undisguised revulsion and cold clinical judgment. Chloe tries to fill the suffocating silence with nervous, high-pitched chatter. "It was just a joke," she stammers, her voice echoing weakly against the glass walls. She is so clumsy sometimes. "I was just trying to help Winston keep his beautiful floors clean." You know exactly how that is. No one responds to her pathetic, transparent excuses. The absolute silence of 50 elite guests is a crushing, undeniable public indictment of her entire character. I do not look at Chloe as she desperately attempts to backtrack and save her crumbling social facade. I do not look at Valerie and Calvin, whose smug, arrogant expressions have suddenly hardened into rigid lines of nervous uncertainty as they finally register the icy reception from the high society guests. I look straight down the center of the massive U-shaped dining table. I bypass the imported silk linens, the crystal centerpieces, and the weeping ice sculptures. I lock eyes directly with Winston Thorne. The patriarch of the Thorne family sits perfectly still at the head of the table. His hands are resting flat on the mahogany surface, his posture radiating the quiet, absolute power of a man who commands global industries. He is a man who built a massive international empire from the ground up, and he possesses an innate predatory ability to instantly recognize deception, manipulation, and pure, unadulterated trash. Winston does not look at my stained dress or the dirty towel resting in my hand. He looks directly into my eyes, studying the calm, calculated intelligence burning behind my stoic facade. He sees the absolute composure of a woman who just absorbed a brutal public assault without blinking or breaking character. He sees the undeniable, terrifying truth about the family his golden boy son is about to marry into. The silence between us stretches for 5 agonizing seconds, holding the heavy electric weight of 1,000 unspoken words. Then Winston Thorne performs a single deliberate action. He tilts his chin down in a barely perceptible microscopic nod. It is a silent, unbreakable tactical pact forged across a room of horrified billionaires. He understands exactly what I am doing. He understands that I did not fight back because I simply did not need to. I let Chloe completely destroy herself. The trap has fully snapped shut. My family's true ugly nature has been entirely exposed to the very people they are desperately trying to impress. They have completely outed themselves as malicious, classless frauds who lack the basic human decency required to function in this elevated social sphere. Their desperate, greedy masquerade has officially imploded under the blinding spotlight of their own toxic arrogance, leaving them with absolutely nowhere left to hide from the devastating fallout. The entire carefully orchestrated illusion they built is now lying in ruins scattered across the pristine white marble floor alongside the shattered glass and spilled vintage wine. I hold Winston's gaze for one final second, silently returning his microscopic nod. I turn around and walk silently out of the glass pavilion, carrying the soaked bar towel with me. The stage is perfectly set for tomorrow's wedding, where the absolute final nail will be ruthlessly driven deep into the wooden coffin of their entirely fraudulent, pathetic existence. The morning sun filters through the towering stained glass windows of the Thorne Estate Grand Ballroom, illuminating a scene of staggering, sickening excess. Chloe stands at the exact center of the vast room, looking like a porcelain doll dipped in stolen diamonds. She is wearing a custom $15,000 designer gown. The structured bodice is heavily encrusted with hand-sewn pearls, and the shimmering silk train stretches out for yards across the polished hardwood floor. She looks radiant and entirely oblivious to the fact that she is currently wearing a federal felony. Every single yard of imported silk, every rare white orchid cascading from the crystal chandeliers, and every glass of vintage champagne currently circulating the room was purchased using the sleek black Vanguard corporate card she stole from my purse. My forensic accounting team, led by Marcus, has been working relentlessly through the night. They have been meticulously cataloging the final staggering charges, building a digital mountain of irrefutable evidence. The total financial theft has breached a threshold that absolutely guarantees maximum federal sentencing. I stand quietly near the heavy velvet drapes, watching my sister twirl for her sycophantic bridesmaids, completely intoxicated by her fraudulent temporary kingdom. A famous high society photographer claps his hands loudly, trying to corral the chaotic, frantic energy of the bridal party. He directs everyone toward the massive white marble fireplace to prepare for the formal family portraits. Valerie and Calvin immediately rush forward, practically sprinting across the room to position themselves on either side of their golden child. Calvin adjusts his rented tuxedo, pulling his heavy stomach in and puffing out his chest to project an air of wealthy authority. Valerie obsessively smooths the front of her expensive mother-of-the-bride dress, her eyes darting nervously around the room to ensure the elite Thorne family guests are properly witnessing her ultimate triumph. She wants everyone to believe she belongs in this world of private jets and generational wealth. I walk slowly toward the fireplace, my footsteps completely silent on the thick Persian rug. I am wearing a simple, understated, tailored dress, entirely devoid of the flashy designer labels my family so desperately craves. I am here solely to witness the final catastrophic act of this grotesque play. The photographer waves his hands frantically, gesturing for the immediate family to step closer together and fill the frame. I calmly step forward, intending to take my designated familiar position at the absolute far edge of the group. Before my foot can even settle on the marble hearth, Valerie violently twists her body toward me. She does not say a single word at first. She simply lifts her arm and physically shoves my shoulder backward with a surprising amount of aggressive, blunt force. The unexpected physical impact forces me to stumble a step back, completely removing my body from the camera lens. I catch my balance and look directly up into my mother's eyes. They are entirely devoid of any maternal warmth, replaced by a cold, calculating, intense cruelty. "Just the successful ones, Zuri," she commands, her voice dropping to a harsh, venomous whisper that slices straight through the ambient noise of the crowded ballroom. "Go wait in the hallway with the catering staff, so you are not in the background." Valerie instantly turns back to the camera, flashing a brilliant artificial smile, as if she did not just physically assault her eldest daughter. Calvin chuckles softly, adjusting his silk tie, perfectly comfortable with my public humiliation. This physical and emotional removal is a deeply ingrained, cherished family tradition. Standing there, I feel the phantom sting of a dozen past vicious exclusions rushing back to the surface. I remember being 12 years old and forcefully shoved out of the frame of our annual holiday card because my cheap wire braces ruined the flawless aesthetic Valerie wanted to project to her suburban country club friends. I remember standing in the pouring rain outside my high school graduation while Calvin took endless photos of Chloe holding my hard-earned diploma, claiming the thick paper simply looked much better in her delicate hands. They have spent my entire life actively trying to erase me from the family narrative, treating my very existence as a shameful, dark stain on their completely fabricated legacy. They expect me to argue right now. They desperately want me to ruin the elegant, sophisticated atmosphere with a pathetic, desperate plea for inclusion. They want to prove to the room that I am the unstable, jealous sister. Instead, I maintain my absolute, terrifying composure. I do not let a single emotion cross my face. I do not sigh or roll my eyes. I simply take another slow step backward, disappearing into the dark shadows of the heavy velvet drapes, perfectly willing to let them dig their graves just a few inches deeper. I turn on my heel to walk toward the catering hallway exactly as my mother instructed. As I pivot, my eyes catch a sudden sharp movement at the grand arched entrance of the ballroom. Julian and Winston Thorne have just walked into the room. They are both wearing immaculate, custom-tailored tuxedos, radiating the quiet, dangerous power of established old money. They arrived exactly in time to witness the entire violent, unprovoked exchange. Julian stops dead in his tracks, his expensive leather shoes halting on the polished wood. The polite, easygoing smile he usually wears completely vanishes from his face. His dark eyes are locked onto Valerie, and his jaw clenches so tightly I can clearly see a muscle ticking rapidly in his cheek. He heard every single venomous whispered word. He saw the aggressive physical shove. The horrifying, sickening reality of the family he is about to legally bind himself to hits him with the devastating force of a freight train. The pure disgust rolling off him is palpable, a physical wave of revulsion that temporarily freezes his body in place. He looks at Chloe, who is still smiling brightly and posing for the camera, entirely ignorant of the fact that her fiancé is currently staring at her like she is a terrifying stranger. Julian takes a hesitant step forward, clearly intending to intervene, to pull me back into the center of the room and aggressively demand an explanation from my parents. But Winston Thorne moves much faster. The billionaire patriarch steps smoothly in front of his son, deliberately blocking Julian's path forward. Winston does not look angry. He does not look shocked. He looks terrifyingly calm and entirely in control of his domain. He shoots me a barely perceptible microscopic nod across the vast expanse of the grand ballroom. It is the exact same silent, unbreakable acknowledgement we shared last night over the shattered glass and the spilled vintage wine. The invisible, deadly trap I set exactly 2 months ago has finally reached its ultimate, violent conclusion. My family's true, ugly nature has been entirely exposed to the very people they are desperately trying to impress and manipulate. Winston does not say a single word to my parents. He does not reprimand Valerie for her disgusting abusive behavior or demand that Calvin apologize for his sickening complicity. He simply strides directly into the dead center of the massive room, his immense presence commanding the immediate absolute attention of every single person present. He raises his right hand high into the air, signaling the live wedding band positioned on the upper balcony. The conductor sees the gesture and immediately drops his baton. The cheerful, uplifting classical music cuts off with a sudden jarring screech of violin strings. The sudden absolute silence in the grand ballroom is deafening and incredibly heavy. Winston slowly lowers his hand, folding his arms behind his back, and turns slowly to face my sister and my parents. The stage is officially set. Winston Thorne commands the room without uttering a single syllable. The halt of the string quartet leaves a silence in the massive grand ballroom. 300 of the most influential people freeze in place. Waiters stop mid-step, holding trays of champagne. Politicians lower their glasses. Tech moguls turn their heads, their conversations dying instantly. The air in the room becomes heavy, suffocating under the weight of Winston's dark, focused stare. He walks slowly toward the elevated stage where the band stands completely paralyzed by his sudden intervention. Every step he takes across the polished hardwood floor echoes like a gavel striking a block. He ascends the 3 short steps to the platform and extends his right hand toward the trembling bandleader. The terrified musician scrambles to unclip the silver microphone from its stand and places it directly into Winston's palm. The feedback whines sharply for a fraction of a second before Winston silences it with a firm, practiced grip. He turns around to face the crowd. His eyes sweep over the sea of designer gowns and custom tuxedos, finally settling on my family standing closely together near the marble fireplace. Valerie is still adjusting the neckline of her dress, completely oblivious to the impending, inescapable doom. Chloe is holding the skirt of her $15,000 designer gown, posing slightly, entirely convinced this dramatic interruption is simply a prelude to a grand public declaration of her beauty and absolute grace. Winston slowly lifts the microphone to his mouth. His voice is deep, incredibly rich, and devoid of any human warmth. Before my son marries into this family, Winston announces, the sound booming through the state-of-the-art acoustic speakers, I think it is time we acknowledge the woman funding this entire event. The powerful words hang heavily in the crisp, air-conditioned atmosphere of the magnificent ballroom. Calvin instantly responds exactly as a predictable, egotistical parasite would in this highly specific situation. He literally puffs out his chest, inhaling deeply to maximize his physical presence in front of the wealthy crowd. He reaches down with his thick, clumsy fingers and proudly buttons the center button of his rented black tuxedo jacket, actively attempting to look distinguished, dignified, and commanding. A wide, smug, self-satisfied smile stretches across his aging face. He nudges Valerie aggressively with his elbow, confirming his absolute pathetic delusion. He fully expects Winston to announce a toast to his personal legacy, his fake business acumen, and his supposedly generous financial contribution to this lavish, over-the-top wedding. He genuinely believes Winston is about to validate the fabricated reality my parents have desperately sold to the entire city. Valerie practically vibrates with excitement. She tilts her chin upward, arranging her sharp features into a sickening mask of humble superiority. Chloe mirrors her parents, stepping slightly forward into the open space, perfectly ready to accept the endless adoration of her future father-in-law. They are utterly convinced that the endless stream of exorbitant charges flooding my corporate account over the last 60 days somehow translated into their own personal legitimate financial power. They actually think the melting ice sculptures, the imported white orchids, and the beluga caviar have successfully bought them a permanent, respected seat at the billionaire's table. They are physically bracing themselves for a massive tidal wave of high society applause. I watch quietly from the shadowy perimeter of the room, leaning casually against the heavy velvet drapes near the swinging wooden catering doors. I do not move a single muscle. I do not breathe heavily. I simply watch the mechanical trap slowly spring. Winston does not look at Calvin. He completely ignores the pathetic, puffed-up posture of the delusional man standing proudly by the fireplace. His eyes slice right past Valerie's expectant, hungry smile and Chloe's radiant, entirely fraudulent glow. Winston turns his body slowly, deliberately, shifting his intense attention away from the center of the room. He extends his arm and points the silver microphone directly toward the dimly lit hallway entrance where the catering staff is currently huddled. He points directly at me. "I would like to introduce Zuri Washington." Winston declares, his voice ringing with absolute terrifying clarity that bounces off the crystal chandeliers. "The sole founder and chief executive officer of Vanguard Facilities Group, the majority contractor for Thorn Real Estate." The silence that follows is not just quiet, it is a total vacuum-sealed absence of sound. 300 heads turn simultaneously, tracking the exact direction of Winston's outstretched arm. The elite crowd parts like the Red Sea, creating a wide, completely unobstructed path between the billionaire patriarch on the stage and the woman they all just assumed was a lowly assistant or a banished, disgraceful relative. The physical force of their collective gaze hits me, but I do not shrink away. I step out from the dark shadows of the velvet drapes. I step away from the catering doors. I stand incredibly tall in my simple, unbranded charcoal dress. I hold my head high, projecting the exact same quiet, lethal power that Winston Thorne currently radiates from the stage. The realization hits the room in a rapid sequence of devastating crashing waves. The corporate titans and industry leaders in the audience instantly recognize the name Vanguard Facilities Group. They know my company extremely well. They know we secure and manage the absolute largest commercial portfolios in the entire region. They know my personal net worth easily rivals half the people currently standing in this ballroom. The frantic whispers begin immediately. A low, panicked buzzing spreads quickly through the crowd as the high society guests rapidly connect the necessary dots. The woman violently shoved aside, the woman verbally abused and treated like dirt, is the actual financial titan. I shift my focus from the murmuring crowd directly to the family standing frozen by the fireplace. Calvin's puffed-out chest instantly deflates like a punctured balloon. The smug, arrogant smile completely melts off his face, quickly replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated, paralyzing shock. His thick fingers nervously fumble with the button of his tuxedo jacket, suddenly desperate to make his massive body look considerably smaller. Valerie's carefully constructed mask of humble superiority completely and totally shatters. Her mouth drops open, her eyes widening in absolute horror as she stares blankly at me. She looks utterly terrified, her mind violently struggling to properly process the mathematically impossible truth. The daughter she threw out onto the wet grass at 18, the daughter she continuously humiliated and degraded at every opportunity, is a self-made multimillionaire standing in the exact same room, silently watching her burn to the ground. But Chloe's reaction is the absolute cinematic masterpiece of this entire evening. Chloe is not just shocked or surprised. She is currently experiencing a total catastrophic biological systems failure. She looks at Winston, then at me, and then slowly looks down at her $15,000 designer gown. The hand-sewn pearls and imported silk suddenly look like heavy, suffocating metal chains. The stolen black card resting inside her designer clutch purse must currently feel like an active, ticking live grenade. The puzzle pieces violently slam together in her mind with brutal, entirely unforgiving force. Vanguard Facilities Group. The specific corporate account she has been blindly, gleefully, and aggressively draining for 2 entire months. She truly believed she was spending Julian's money, or perhaps some magical, unlimited high-interest credit line my parents had secretly secured. She never once bothered to read the company name printed clearly across the matte black plastic. She realizes right here in front of 300 elite guests that she just committed massive, irrefutable, completely documented federal wire fraud against her own sister's multi-million-dollar commercial corporation. Chloe's breathing becomes incredibly rapid and dangerously shallow. Her hands start shaking violently, her perfectly manicured nails trembling against the silk fabric. The beautiful, radiant bride quickly turns a sickly, horrifying shade of pale ash gray. She stumbles backward, her high heels awkwardly catching on the heavy silk train of her stolen dress. She looks desperately toward Julian for emotional and physical support, reaching out a trembling, panic-stricken hand to forcefully grab his arm. Julian actively recoils. He steps backward, putting a definitive, completely undeniable physical distance between himself and the manic woman he was supposed to marry tomorrow afternoon. His face hardens into a rigid mask of pure, visceral, unadulterated disgust. He looks at Chloe like she is a highly venomous snake that just attempted to bite him. He clearly heard Valerie tell me to go stand with the catering staff. He clearly saw the aggressive physical shove. He now fully understands that the massive, extravagant wedding weekend he is currently attending is entirely funded by stolen corporate money. Julian turns his back on Chloe without saying a single solitary word, completely and utterly abandoning her standing alone in front of his own father's entire, incredibly influential high society social circle. The absolute silence in the grand ballroom is a heavy, suffocating blanket pressing down on the 300 elite guests. Winston Thorne stands in the dead center of the polished hardwood floor, radiating the quiet, lethal power of a man who commands global empires. He grips the silver microphone tightly in his hand. Valerie and Calvin are entirely frozen in their places. The smug, triumphant smiles they wore mere seconds ago have violently contorted into masks of sheer, unadulterated panic. They do not understand the sudden, terrifying shift in power. Calvin aggressively puffs out his chest and buttons his rented tuxedo jacket, desperately trying to project an air of wealthy authority. He flashes a proud, sickening smile toward the head table. He fully expects Winston to announce a grand public toast to his fabricated family legacy and his supposedly generous financial contribution to this lavish, extravagant high society wedding celebration. Valerie aggressively smooths the front of her expensive silk dress, her eyes darting nervously around the room, ensuring the high society guests are properly witnessing her ultimate triumph. They firmly believe they have finally secured their permanent seats at the billionaire table. Winston does not even look at Calvin. He completely ignores the pathetic, puffed-up posture of the delusional man standing proudly by the marble fireplace. His dark, penetrating eyes slice right past Valerie's expectant, hungry smile and Chloe's radiant, entirely fraudulent glow. Winston turns his body slowly, deliberately shifting his intense attention away from the center of the room. He extends his arm and points the silver microphone directly toward the dimly lit hallway entrance where the catering staff is currently huddled. He points directly at me. "I would like to introduce Zuri Washington." Winston declares, his voice ringing with absolute terrifying clarity that bounces off the acoustic ceiling. The sole founder and chief executive officer of Vanguard Facilities Group, the majority contractor for Thorne Real Estate. The realization hits the room in a rapid sequence of devastating crashing waves. The corporate titans and industry leaders in the audience instantly recognize the name Vanguard Facilities Group. They know my company extremely well. They know we secure and manage the absolute largest commercial portfolios in the entire region. The frantic whispers begin immediately as the high society guests rapidly connect the necessary dots. The woman violently shoved aside is the financial titan. The color violently drains from my family's faces, leaving them looking like hollow, sickly ghosts. Calvin's puffed-out chest instantly deflates like a punctured balloon. The smug, arrogant smile completely melts off his face, quickly replaced by a look of sheer, paralyzing shock. Valerie's carefully constructed mask of humble superiority completely and totally shatters into sharp, jagged pieces. Her mouth drops completely open, her eyes widening in absolute horror as she stares blankly at me. She looks utterly terrified, her mind violently struggling to properly process the mathematically impossible truth. Before my parents can even attempt to formulate a single pathetic excuse, Winston drops the second massive, devastating bombshell. He turns back to the crowd, his expression shifting into something deeply serious and profoundly emotional. Before my son marries into this family, I think it is time we acknowledge the woman funding this entire event. Winston says, his voice a low, powerful rumble. But my connection to Zuri Washington goes far deeper than a simple corporate partnership. Winston sweeps his dark gaze across the silent room. 10 years ago, I was driving down a slick, rain-soaked highway late at night. A drunk driver swerved across the grassy median and struck my vehicle head-on with terrifying force. My car flipped 3 times and immediately burst into flames. Winston continues painting a horrifying, vivid picture of his near-death experience. I was securely trapped inside the crushed, burning metal, entirely conscious, but completely unable to free myself from the wreckage. The heat was absolutely unbearable. I had fully accepted that I was going to burn alive on that highway. But then, a young girl smashed the remaining glass of my window. She reached her bare hands directly into the searing hot metal and actively burning upholstery. She grabbed me by the collar and dragged my heavy body out to the safety of the damp grass, just seconds before the gas tank completely detonated. By the time the paramedics arrived, the young girl had completely vanished into the dark, rainy night. I spent an entire decade hiring private investigators and searching desperately for the anonymous hero who saved me. I found nothing. She refused money or recognition. She simply saved a life. I discovered her identity 2 months ago when I signed the Vanguard contract. Zuri Washington, please raise your right hand. I slowly lift my hand, turning my palm outward for the entire ballroom to witness. A thick, twisted web of severe burn scars covers the entire surface of my skin. It is the permanent, violent mark of tearing a dying man out of a burning car. The collective gasp from the elite crowd is deafening. Valerie clutches her chest, looking physically ill. Calvin stares at my scarred hand with wide, terrified eyes. They always knew about the severe burn. I came home that night in agonizing pain, wrapping my hand in cheap drugstore bandages. They never once asked how I got injured. They simply yelled at me for actively bleeding all over their precious white hallway carpet. They are now terrifyingly realizing that the unwanted daughter they treated like absolute garbage literally saved the life of a famous billionaire. Chloe is staring blankly at my damaged hand, her jaw hanging completely open in absolute shock. Her $15,000 designer gown suddenly looks utterly ridiculous against the backdrop of true heroic sacrifice. She desperately tries to speak, but only a pathetic, quiet squeak escapes her dry throat. Winston does not allow them a single solitary second to recover their composure. His expression instantly shifts from deep reverence to pure, unadulterated, lethal disgust. He reaches inside the breast pocket of his custom-tailored tuxedo jacket and pulls out a thick, heavy stack of folded papers. These documents were provided to me directly by the Vanguard Corporate Forensic Accounting Team. Winston announces, his voice cracking like a whip across the incredibly silent, completely captivated grand ballroom. They are comprehensive, irrefutable financial audits tracking the last 60 days of spending. He holds the documents up high, the bright chandelier light catching the crisp white pages. Chloe's lavish, unlimited wedding budget is not a product of her own success or some magical high-interest credit line. Every single yard of imported silk, every rare white orchid, and this very $15,000 designer gown she is wearing right now was purchased using a stolen corporate card. Winston glares directly at Chloe, his dark eyes pinning her to the polished hardwood floor. This entire extravagant wedding is entirely funded by exactly $120,000 of felony credit card fraud committed against Vanguard corporate accounts. The absolute silence in the grand ballroom shatters completely. The high society guests erupt into a chorus of loud, outraged gasps and horrified whispers. The elite crowd physically recoils immediately in horror. The elite crowd steps backward and creates a wide, empty circle of sheer, absolute disgust around my entire fraudulent family. Chloe's breathing becomes incredibly rapid and dangerously shallow. Her hands start shaking violently, her perfectly manicured nails trembling against the stolen silk fabric. The beautiful, radiant bride quickly turns a sickly, horrifying shade of pale ash gray. She stumbles backward, her expensive high heels awkwardly catching on the heavy train of her dress. The absolute devastating reality of her situation crashes down on her. She is not a wealthy socialite. She is a common criminal caught dead to rights in front of 300 influential witnesses. Chloe completely breaks down. She bursts into loud, ugly theatrical tears, desperately trying to play the innocent victim one last time. "It was a misunderstanding," Chloe stammers loudly, her voice cracking with sheer, unadulterated panic. "Zuri gave me the card as a generous gift. She told me to use it. It was a gift for the wedding. You have to believe me." She turns wildly toward my parents, begging them to support her pathetic, fabricated lies. Valerie and Calvin are entirely paralyzed, utterly incapable of defending her against a billionaire armed with federal financial audits. Chloe turns her frantic, desperate gaze toward Julian. She lunges toward him, reaching out a trembling, panic-stricken hand to forcefully grab his tuxedo sleeve. "Julian, babe, please, you have to defend me!" Chloe weeps, her face contorted in a grotesque mask of fake agony. Julian stands completely perfectly still. He looks down at her grasping hands. He reaches up to the lapel of his custom-tailored tuxedo jacket. He smoothly unpins the expensive white orchid boutonniere. He drops it on the floor. "The wedding is off," Julian says. He completely turns and silently walks out of the ballroom. The heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom slam shut behind Julian with a resounding crack. Chaos erupts instantly. The 300 elite guests do not simply whisper. They clamor loudly, their voices overlapping in a frantic rising wave of pure, unadulterated scandal. In the dead center of the room, Chloe collapses onto the imported Persian rug. She lands hard on her knees, her $15,000 stolen silk gown pooling around her like a deflating parachute. She covers her face with her trembling hands, sobbing hysterically and screaming the name of her former fiancé into the empty space. No one moves to comfort her. The high society crowd actively recoils physically, stepping backward to avoid any possible association with the disgraced, sobbing fraud. The invisible, impenetrable wall of social ruin has already descended, completely trapping her inside. Valerie and Calvin remain frozen for exactly 3 agonizing seconds before the catastrophic reality of their situation finally overrides their shock. The billionaire safety net they desperately banked their entire fabricated existence on has just walked out the door. The massive secret debts they have been meticulously hiding for years are suddenly looming over them like a crushing avalanche. Without the Thorne family wealth to silently absorb their reckless spending, their carefully constructed house of cards is actively collapsing. Calvin turns a sickly, mottled shade of purple. He violently grabs Valerie, dragging her away from their weeping golden child and pulling her directly toward me. They rush across the polished hardwood floor, their shoes slipping frantically as they try to close the distance. They are completely panicking. Their eyes are wide and wild, darting nervously toward Winston Thorne, who still stands tall on the stage watching them with cold, clinical detachment. They stop 2 feet away from me, entirely breathless and sweating profusely. Valerie forces a terrified, trembling smile onto her face. It is a grotesque, unnatural expression that deeply contorts her sharp features. She reaches out her hands desperately, wanting to touch my arm, but she stops abruptly when I do not move a single muscle. "Zuri, sweetheart," she gasps, her voice shaking with a pathetic manufactured affection I have never once heard directed at me. "We always knew you were a genius. We always knew you would build an incredible empire." Her eyes are wide and completely desperate, pleading silently with me to go along with this incredibly transparent, sickening lie. "We were just pushing you to succeed," she continues, her voice rising in pitch as she tries to convince the surrounding elite guests. "That is exactly why we were so incredibly hard on you. It was tough love, Zuri. We wanted you to reach your absolute maximum potential. We are incredibly proud of you." Calvin eagerly nods his head so fast, it looks like a painful physical spasm. "Exactly, Zuri," he stammers, sweat actively beading on his forehead and dripping onto the collar of his rented tuxedo. "Everything we did was completely for your own personal benefit. We are family. Blood is thicker than water." He leans in closer, lowering his voice to a frantic, desperate whisper, hoping Winston cannot hear him. "Please, Zuri, you cannot press charges against your sister. You simply cannot do this to us. If Vanguard files a police report, Chloe will go to federal prison. We will be absolutely ruined. The aggressive creditors are already furiously calling the house every single day. If we lose the Thorn connection, we lose absolutely everything. They will take the house, Zuri. They will take the cars. You have more than enough money to cover this minor expense. It is a drop in the bucket for a corporate executive like you. Just write it off as a generous wedding gift. Please be the bigger person here." I look at Calvin taking in his pathetic, hunched posture and the sheer, unadulterated terror radiating from his sweating pores. I slowly shift my gaze to Valerie, watching the desperate fake smile violently tremble on her lips. They are standing in front of 300 horrified billionaires, openly begging the daughter they relentlessly abused for financial salvation. I remember the engagement party precisely 2 months ago. I remember standing in their pristine suburban kitchen while Valerie mocked my business, telling her country club friends that I clean toilets for a living. I feel absolutely nothing for them. There is no lingering sorrow, no residual anger, and definitely no pity. There is only a profound, icy clarity. I look directly into my mother's panicked, searching eyes. "I clean floors for a living, Mom." I state, my voice calm and projecting perfectly into the surrounding silence. "And right now I am taking out the trash." Valerie physically recoils as if I just struck her across the face with a heavy iron bar. Her mouth drops completely open, but absolutely no sound emerges. Calvin lets out a pathetic, defeated whimper, taking a slow, stumbling step backward. I do not wait for another response. I do not look back at Chloe, who is still wailing hysterically on the floor. I turn my back on my biological family and walk smoothly toward the grand arched exit. The crowd parts silently for me, their faces reflecting a mixture of deep respect and absolute terror. I pull my phone from the pocket of my tailored charcoal dress. I open my secure email application and type a short message to Marcus, my lead corporate attorney. File the police report immediately. Authorize the full criminal prosecution. I press send right as I step out of the grand ballroom and into the cool, quiet marble hallway. The heavy doors close behind me, officially sealing the tomb on their completely fraudulent existence. The devastating fallout is incredibly swift, absolute, and entirely merciless. By Tuesday morning, Chloe is officially arrested at our parents' suburban home by federal agents. The local news stations broadcast the humiliating footage of her being escorted out the front door in steel handcuffs, her tear-stained face hidden behind her loose hair. The grand larceny charges carry a mandatory minimum federal sentence, and the undeniable digital paper trail provided by Vanguard leaves her high-priced defense attorney with absolutely zero room to maneuver. The Thorne family immediately and aggressively distances themselves publicly, issuing a cold, brief press release, completely disavowing any connection to the fraudulent bride. The elite high society circles Valerie spent decades meticulously infiltrating instantly slam their doors shut permanently, blacklisting my parents from every single country club charity gala and social event in the entire state. Without the protective illusion of the Thorne wedding, the aggressive creditors quickly descend like a pack of starving wolves. Within one short month, the massive suburban house is officially foreclosed on. The luxury cars are repossessed from the driveway in the middle of the afternoon. Calvin and Valerie are forced to quietly pack their remaining cheap possessions into rented cardboard boxes and move into a tiny, cramped apartment complex on the absolute worst side of the city. 6 months later, the morning sun shines brightly through the massive floor-to-ceiling glass walls of the Vanguard Facilities Group executive boardroom. The view of the sprawling, gorgeous Atlanta skyline is completely breathtaking. I stand near the edge of the polished glass, looking out over the busy, bustling city that my company actively helps secure and maintain. The air in the room is cool, crisp, and smells faintly of rich, expensive leather and fresh brewed dark roast coffee. I am wearing a stunning, custom-tailored white designer suit that fits my frame perfectly, radiating an aura of complete, absolute authority. Winston Thorne sits comfortably at the long mahogany conference table, quietly reviewing a stack of lucrative international expansion contracts. He looks up from the crisp white papers and smiles a warm, genuine expression of deep mutual respect. Our professional relationship has seamlessly evolved into a powerful, unstoppable business partnership. He is a trusted, brilliant mentor who actively challenges me to push the boundaries of my growing corporate empire. I turn away from the city skyline and walk toward the mahogany table. I pull out my leather executive chair and sit down smoothly, resting my scarred right hand casually on the cool, polished wood. I look down at the silver-twisted burns covering my palm, running my thumb lightly over the textured, damaged skin. It is a permanent daily reminder of the exact moment I chose to save a life instead of walking away. It is the defining mark of true, authentic strength. I am no longer the unwanted, forgotten sister hiding in the dark shadows of a suburban hallway. I am no longer the designated family failure forced to silently absorb endless cruel insults and pathetic, degrading comparisons. I am entirely unbothered, completely independent, and undeniably powerful. The heavy, toxic weight of my past has been completely lifted, leaving behind a brilliant, limitless future. I look across the table at Winston, ready to conquer the next massive challenge. The empire is now secure.